The perfect crime is a battle waged on two fronts. The first is the physical world, a world of fibers, fingerprints, and DNA. The second is the internal world, a world of ego, psychology, and human fallibility. To succeed, the criminal must achieve perfection on both fronts. To fail, they need only make a single mistake on one. And as history has shown, time and time again, that single mistake is not a matter of if, but when. The pressure to maintain the lie, the relentless advance of science, and the simple, unpredictable nature of chance all conspire against the would-be mastermind. The house of cards they have so carefully constructed is destined to fall. It only needs one card to be pulled. Let's pull the first card. Let's talk about the digital ghost that haunted a community for 30 years. A ghost who believed he could play games with the police forever. Let's talk about the man who called himself BTK and the floppy disk that ended his reign of terror. For 31 years, the city of Wichita, Kansas, lived in the shadow of a phantom. He was a killer who gave himself a name, a chillingly simple moniker that described his brutal method. Bind, torture, kill. BTK. He was a specter who emerged from the darkness to commit horrific acts of violence and then vanished without a trace, leaving behind only terror and a series of taunting letters to the police and media. From his first murders in 1974 to his last known killing in 1991, Dennis Rader was the embodiment of the successful serial killer. He was a meticulous planner, a predator who stalked his victims for weeks or even months, learning their routines, their habits, the layouts of their homes. He was a family man, a church council president, a compliance officer, a pillar of the community, hiding in plain sight. This was the foundation of his perfect crime spree, a mask of absolute normalcy. He left behind minimal physical evidence. He was forensically aware, wearing gloves, and taking steps to control the crime scene. For years, the DNA and other scant evidence collected from the scenes led nowhere. The cases went cold, but the legend of BTK grew. He became a Midwestern boogeyman, a story told to scare people into locking their doors at night. Rader, meanwhile, reveled in his secret infamy, collecting news clippings and personal trophies from his crimes. After 1991, the killings stopped. The letters ceased. BTK went silent. For 13 years, it seemed as though he had simply disappeared, perhaps dead, perhaps incarcerated for some other crime. The city of Wichita began to breathe a tentative sigh of relief. The nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. But the one variable Rader could not control was his own colossal ego. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of his first murders, BTK resurfaced. He could not stand the thought of being forgotten. He began sending letters and packages again, a new wave of taunts designed to reclaim his place in the spotlight. He sent crime scene photos, a victim's driver's license, and cryptic puzzles to the local media. He was re-engaging in the game, a game he had been winning for 3 decades. This was his first mistake. By re-establishing contact, he opened a new front in a war he had already won. He was reintroducing himself into a world that had changed dramatically since 1991. The internet, digital forensics, and data analysis were now standard tools of investigation. Rader, a man whose criminal methodologies were forged in the 1970s, was about to step into a 21st century minefield. His communications became more frequent, his arrogance more pronounced. He wanted to know if the police could track him through his modern communications. In one package, he included a question that would seal his fate. He asked a local television station, through a coded message, if he could communicate with them via a floppy disk without being traced. He wanted to know if the police could find him if he sent them a disk. This was the moment the investigation pivoted. The police saw an opportunity, a chance to leverage Rader's technological ignorance against him. They decided to play his game. Through a classified ad in the local newspaper, a method of communication Rader had previously suggested, the police responded with a one-word message: "Rex, it will be okay." They were lying. They were telling him it was safe. It was the lie that would catch a monster. Rader, believing the police were either unable or unwilling to trace the disc, took the bait. On February 16, 2005, he mailed a 3.5-inch floppy disk to a Fox affiliate in Wichita. It was a purple Memorex disk, a seemingly innocuous piece of outdated technology. But for the forensic investigators waiting to pounce, it was the Rosetta Stone to a 30-year-old mystery. The disk was immediately rushed to a forensic computer lab. The investigators on the case knew this was their shot. Rader had made a tangible error, handing them a physical piece of his digital world. The file on the disk was a Microsoft Word document, another letter filled with the usual taunts and ramblings. But the content of the letter was irrelevant. The real clues were hidden in the code, in the invisible data that Word automatically embeds in every document, the metadata. Forensic analysts began to carefully peel back the digital layers of the file. They were looking for any fragment of information that could point to the document's origin. And then they found it. Buried in the metadata was the name of the last person to modify the document, Dennis. And even more damning, it listed the location where the document was created, Christ Lutheran Church. It was a thunderbolt. For the first time in 30 years, they had a first name and a specific physical location. The investigation, which had been a sprawling nationwide search for a nameless phantom, was now laser-focused on a single point. Detectives immediately began searching for anyone named Dennis with a connection to the Christ Lutheran Church. The search didn't take long. A quick check of the church's council records revealed its president, Dennis Rader. The pieces began to fall into place with breathtaking speed. Rader lived in nearby Park City. He worked as a compliance officer, giving him an air of authority and a reason to be trolling neighborhoods. He fit the general profile. The 30-year-old ghost was starting to take on a face and a name. But they needed more. They needed to connect Dennis Rader, the church president, to the DNA left at the BTK crime scenes. The final piece of the puzzle required a delicate and secret operation. Investigators obtained a warrant to test a pap smear that had been taken from Rader's daughter at the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. They needed her DNA to perform a familial DNA comparison against the semen samples collected from the 1974 Otero family murder scene. The lab results were conclusive. The DNA from the crime scene showed a strong familiar match to the DNA of Rader's daughter. It indicated that the killer was her father. The Phantom of Wichita was a phantom no more. On February 25, 2005, 31 years after his first murder, Dennis Rader was pulled over in his vehicle and calmly arrested. His perfect crime spree, a reign of terror that had baffled police for a generation, was undone not by a slip of the tongue, not by a fingerprint, but by his own ego-driven need to play a game, and his complete misunderstanding of a piece of technology he considered safe. He thought he was a criminal mastermind, a cunning predator playing with his food. But in the end, he was just a man who didn't know how to delete the metadata from a Word document. Dennis Rader's mistake was a classic case of an analog criminal operating in a digital world. His methods of terror were rooted in the pre-internet era of handwritten letters and payphone calls. When he re-emerged in 2004, he tried to adapt, to use the tools of the modern world to continue his campaign of fear. But he didn't understand the rules of this new game. He saw the floppy disk as just another envelope, a container for his message. He failed to comprehend that the container itself was a message. Every digital file is a collection of ghosts, a record of its own history. The creation date, the author's name, the computer it was made on, the last time it was saved, these are the digital fingerprints that are left behind, often invisibly, on everything we create. This case became a landmark in the history of digital forensics. It was a powerful demonstration that the most damning clues are not always the obvious ones. The investigation shifted from looking at what the killer was saying to looking at how he was saying it. The medium had become the evidence. It was a lesson that would be repeated time and time again in the years to come, as criminals increasingly left digital trails of their activities. The irony of Rader's capture is profound. He was a man obsessed with control. He controlled his victims, he controlled the media narrative, and for 30 years he controlled his own secret. But his desire for control was also his fatal flaw. His need to be recognized, to be feared, to be seen as a criminal genius is what drove him out of the shadows and into the light of a forensic investigation he was completely unprepared for. He asked the police if it was safe, and they told him yes. It was a simple deception, a lie told to a liar, a trap set for a predator. And he walked right into it, blinded by his own arrogance. The man who called himself BTK, the monster who haunted a city's dreams, was ultimately brought down by a purple floppy disk and a single word: Dennis. This case serves as a powerful preamble to our exploration of evidence mistakes. It bridges the old world of crime with the new. Rader was, in many ways, a classic 20th century serial killer. His methods were brutal, his taunts were theatrical, and his ability to blend in was his greatest weapon. But he was caught by a 21st century tool he couldn't even see. The ghost in the machine had finally met its match. The invisible world of data had ensnared the invisible killer, proving that no matter how carefully you plan, you can never account for the evidence you don't know exists. And in the digital age, that evidence is everywhere, waiting silently for someone to know how to look for it. Our next case takes us from the digital world to the natural world, from a computer file to a microscopic grain of pollen. It is a story that demonstrates how even the most meticulous and brutal attempts to sanitize a crime scene can be undone by the silent, pervasive testimony of the earth itself. We travel to the small town of Soham in the United Kingdom to uncover a crime that shocked a nation and the botanical witness that helped solve it. In August of 2002, the quiet rural community of Soham, Cambridgeshire, was thrust into the center of a national nightmare. Two 10-year-old best friends, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, vanished from a family barbecue. The girls, dressed in matching Manchester United football shirts, had gone out for a walk and simply disappeared. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in British history. The initial search was frantic and widespread. The faces of the two smiling girls were on every television screen and newspaper front page. The community rallied, searching fields, woods, and waterways, desperate for any sign of the missing children. Among those who appeared on camera, expressing his concern and hope for their safe return, was a local school caretaker named Kevin Huntley. He was a seemingly helpful witness, one of the last people to have seen the girls alive. Huntley told police that he had spoken with Holly and Jessica as they passed his house on the evening they disappeared. He portrayed himself as a concerned member of the community, participating in interviews and describing his brief interaction with the girls. His girlfriend, Maxine Carr, a teaching assistant at the girls' school, provided him with an alibi, claiming she was with him at the time of their disappearance. On the surface, they were just two more worried locals. But behind this facade of normalcy, a dark secret was being frantically concealed. Huntley had lured the two girls into his home and murdered them. He then drove their bodies to a remote, wooded area near an RAF base about 15 miles away and dumped them in a ditch, setting the bodies on fire in a horrific attempt to destroy any evidence that could link him to the crime. Back in Soham, Huntley embarked on a meticulous and systematic campaign to erase his crime. He cleaned his house from top to bottom with powerful chemicals. He removed, burned, and replaced carpets. He thoroughly cleaned his red Ford Fiesta, the car he had used to transport the bodies, vacuuming it repeatedly and washing it inside and out. He believed he had created a forensically sterile environment. He had accounted for blood, fibers, and fingerprints, the classic evidence types he knew police would be looking for. For nearly 2 weeks, his deception held. The investigation was focused on the massive search for the girls, who were still officially considered missing. But as the days turned into weeks with no sign of them, the focus began to shift from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. And the police attention began to zero in on Ian Huntley. His story had minor inconsistencies, and his overly eager participation in the media coverage struck some as suspicious. The turning point came on August 17th, when a gamekeeper discovered the girls' badly decomposed and burned bodies in the remote ditch. The discovery confirmed the nation's worst fears. It was now a double murder investigation. With the discovery of the bodies, the police had a second crime scene, the deposition site, and a potential link to the killer. Investigators returned to Huntley's house and his Ford Fiesta, this time with a warrant and a team of forensic specialists. They knew that Huntley had tried to clean up, but they also knew that no cleaning is ever perfect. They began a painstaking, microscopic search for any trace evidence that might have survived his efforts. It was here that the perfect crime began to unravel, not because of what Huntley had removed, but because of what he had unknowingly brought back with him. While the fire had destroyed much of the direct evidence on the girls' bodies, the area where they were found was rich in botanical life. The soil, the plants, the trees, all of it created a unique environmental fingerprint. A team of forensic ecologists and palynologists, experts in the study of pollen and spores, were brought in to analyze the evidence. This was a relatively niche area of forensics at the time, and it would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire case. The scientists took soil samples from the deposition site, from under Huntley's Ford Fiesta, and from the floor mats inside the car. They also examined the dust and debris collected from the vacuum cleaner used to clean the house. They were looking for a microscopic match, a botanical bridge that could connect Ian Huntley to the place where the girls' bodies were found. The results were devastating for Huntley's alibi. The pollen and spore analysis revealed a unique combination of plant species present at the deposition site. This included pollen from stinging nettles, which were abundant in the ditch, and spores from a specific type of bracken fern. The same unique combination of pollen and spores was found in abundance on the floor mats of Huntley's car and on the tools in his trunk. It was a direct environmental link. But the evidence went even further. Soil samples taken from the wheel arches of the Ford Fiesta were subjected to mineral analysis. The mineral composition of the soil was a perfect match for the chalky, flint-laden soil at the deposition site. It was a type of soil that was not common in the area around Huntley's home in Soham. He had literally carried the crime scene back with him on his tires. This microscopic evidence completely demolished Huntley's claims that he had never been to the remote location. He could not explain how the unique botanical and mineral signature of that specific, out-of-the-way ditch had found its way into his meticulously cleaned car. His attempts to erase the evidence of his crime had focused on the obvious, on the human elements, but he had completely ignored the silent testimony of the natural world. The forensic net tightened further. Despite his extensive cleaning, trace evidence was found inside his house. A single fingerprint belonging to Jessica Chapman was found on a sweet tin. More importantly, fibers from the girls' red Manchester United shirts were found on Huntley's clothing and in his home. The sheer volume of this microscopic evidence created an undeniable web connecting Huntley to the girls and his car to the deposition site. Faced with this overwhelming and irrefutable scientific evidence, Huntley's story began to crumble. His girlfriend, Maxine Carr, eventually admitted that she had lied for him and was not with him on the night of the murders. Huntley himself was forced to change his story, concocting a new lie that one of the girls had suffered a nosebleed and had drowned accidentally in his bathtub, and that he had panicked. This story was inconsistent with the evidence and was not believed by the jury. In December 2003, Ian Huntley was found guilty of the murders of Hawley Wells and Jessica Chapman and sentenced to life in prison. The case was a landmark for the use of botanical and soil evidence in a major criminal investigation in the UK. It showcased how even when a killer goes to extreme lengths to destroy evidence through cleaning and fire, the microscopic world can still provide the crucial links needed for a conviction. Ian Huntley's fatal flaw was a failure of imagination. He conceived of evidence in the traditional sense: blood, hair, fingerprints. He waged a war against these visible enemies, using bleach and fire as his weapons. He believed that if he could eliminate these traces, he would be safe. He never considered that the very air he was breathing, the ground he was walking on, was teeming with billions of tiny witnesses that would stick to his clothes, his shoes, and his car. He underestimated the power of forensic science to see what he could not. He thought he was cleaning a car, but he was merely rearranging the evidence. The vacuum cleaner that he thought was his ally in erasing the crime actually became a perfect collection device for the microscopic clues that would convict him. Every particle of dust and pollen it sucked up was a nail in his coffin. The Soham murders case is a chilling reminder of the pervasiveness of trace evidence. It teaches us that a crime scene is not just a room or a building, it is an entire ecosystem. A criminal cannot pass through it without being marked by it in some way. The evidence of their presence may be invisible to the naked eye, but under the lens of a microscope, it can shout as loudly as a confession. Huntley's meticulous plan was, in reality, a deeply flawed one. It was based on an outdated understanding of what constitutes evidence. In his arrogance, he believed he could outsmart the police. But he couldn't outsmart nature. A single microscopic grain of pollen carried on the breeze and deposited on a car mat became an unbreakable link in the chain of justice, ensuring that the man who stole the lives of two innocent children would never be free to harm anyone again. From the earth, we now turn to the very essence of our being, our genetic code. The case of Ian Huntley showed the power of linking a suspect to a location. Our next case demonstrates a revolutionary leap in forensic science, one that allows investigators to link a crime scene to a suspect who doesn't even exist in their database. We journey to California, to the decades-long reign of terror of a man known only as the Golden State Killer, and the genealogical betrayal that finally gave him a name. The story of the Golden State Killer is a saga of terror that spanned over a decade and cast a shadow of fear across the entire state of California. From 1974 to 1986, a single, elusive predator was responsible for at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. He was a phantom who moved through quiet suburban neighborhoods with terrifying skill, a specter who slipped through windows and sliding glass doors in the dead of night. He was known by many names over the years, a reflection of his evolving crimes and the different jurisdictions he terrorized. In the Sacramento area, he was the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, he was the original Night Stalker. It wasn't until years later, when DNA evidence linked the various crime scenes, that investigators realized these were all the work of one man. The unified moniker, the Golden State Killer, was coined by the late true crime writer Michelle McNamara, who dedicated the final years of her life to hunting him. This man was the architect of what many considered a perfect reign of terror. His planning was meticulous and unnerving. He would spend weeks, sometimes months, stalking his victims. He would break into their homes beforehand to learn the layout, unlock windows, and even place ligatures he would later use to bind them. He was forensically savvy, always wearing a mask and gloves, and often taking souvenirs from his victims, a psychological tactic to further torment them and a way to remove potential evidence. He left behind a trail of devastated lives and terrified communities, but very few clues. His primary mistake, though he wouldn't know it for decades, was leaving his DNA at numerous crime scenes in the form of semen. In the 1970s and 80s, DNA technology was in its infancy. While the evidence was collected and preserved, there was little that could be done with it. The killer's DNA was run through the National Criminal Database, CODIS, countless times over the years, but it never produced a match. This meant he was a ghost, a man who had likely never been arrested for a serious crime, a man living a seemingly normal life. For over 40 years, the case grew colder. Generations of detectives worked on it, retiring without ever knowing the killer's name. The boxes of evidence files grew, filled with dead ends and false leads. The Golden State Killer became one of the most infamous and frustrating cold cases in American history. He had, it seemed, gotten away with it. He had committed a series of nearly perfect crimes and simply vanished. But science, like justice, can be patient. While the killer aged in anonymity, DNA technology was undergoing a revolution. The ability to sequence the entire human genome became cheaper and more accessible, leading to the rise of a new industry, direct-to-consumer genetic testing. Companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe allowed millions of people to explore their heritage by submitting a saliva sample and having their DNA analyzed. This created massive, publicly accessible genealogical databases. In 2017, a new generation of cold case investigators, led by Paul Holes, decided to try a radical new approach. They had the killer's DNA profile, a complete genetic blueprint. What if, they thought, they could treat the killer's DNA not as a criminal profile to be matched in CODIS, but as the profile of an anonymous individual searching for their relatives? What if they could use the public genealogical databases to build the killer's family tree and then trace it down to him? This technique, known as genetic genealogy, was a long shot. It was legally and ethically complex, and there was no guarantee it would work. But with all other leads exhausted, it was the last hope. In 2017, they uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile, obtained from a preserved rape kit, to a public genealogy website called GED Match. This was the fatal flaw in the killer's decades-old plan. He had left behind the one thing that could never truly be erased: his own genetic identity. GED Match is a site where users can upload their raw DNA data from different testing companies to find relatives and explore their ancestry. The site's algorithm immediately went to work, comparing the killer's DNA to the hundreds of thousands of other profiles in its database. It wasn't looking for a direct match, but for partial matches, people who shared significant segments of DNA with the unknown subject, indicating they were relatives. The search hit. The algorithm identified a number of distant cousins of the Golden State Killer. This was the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 40 years. They didn't have the killer, but they had his family. A team of genealogists, including the renowned Barbara Ray Venter, was brought in to begin the monumental task of building a family tree from these distant cousins. It was like solving the most complex Sudoku puzzle imaginable. They started with the shared ancestors of the cousins, great-great-great-grandparents from the 19th century, and began to build the family tree forward through time. They painstakingly traced every branch of the family, using census records, birth and death certificates, newspaper archives, and social media. They were looking for a man who fit the rough profile of the killer, someone who was the right age and had lived in California during the years of the crime spree. Slowly, over several months of relentless genealogical research, they narrowed the possibilities down from thousands of relatives to just a few family branches, and then, finally, to one man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a 72-year-old former police officer who had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer. He was a Navy veteran who served in Vietnam. He lived a quiet life in a Sacramento suburb, right in the heart of the area where the East Area Rapist had begun his reign of terror. He fit the profile perfectly. But they needed to be sure. A profile and a family tree were not enough for an arrest. They needed DeAngelo's DNA to make a direct comparison. The final phase of the investigation was a covert surveillance operation. Investigators tailed DeAngelo, waiting for an opportunity to surreptitiously collect a DNA sample from him. Their first attempt, swabbing the door handle of his car, failed to yield a usable sample. The pressure was immense. Then, after several days of surveillance, they got their break. They watched as DeAngelo went to a Hobby Lobby store. After he left, they collected a tissue he had discarded in a trash can outside. The tissue was rushed to the lab. The results came back as a partial match, enough to confirm they were on the right track, but they wanted a perfect sample. A few days later, they collected another sample from the trash can outside his home. This time, the lab results were definitive. The DNA from the trash can was a perfect match to the DNA from the decades-old crime scenes. They had him. The ghost who had haunted California for over 4 decades finally had a name and a face. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested outside his home. The man who had terrorized his state, who had committed unspeakable acts of violence and then faded into the quiet life of a suburban grandfather, was finally brought to justice by a revolutionary technique that he could never have conceived of when he began his crimes. DeAngelo's fatal mistake was a product of its time. In the 1970s, leaving behind DNA was a calculated risk with very low odds of consequence. He could not have foreseen a future where his own genetic code, the very essence of his identity, could be used to reverse engineer his family tree and lead investigators directly to his doorstep. He could not have predicted that the casual curiosity of his distant cousins, wanting to learn about their ancestry, would be the key to his downfall. This case fundamentally changed the landscape of cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy, once a niche hobby for ancestry enthusiasts, became the most powerful new tool in the forensic arsenal. Since DeAngelo's arrest, the technique has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases, bringing closure to families who had long since given up hope of ever finding answers. It has become a nightmare for criminals who thought they had gotten away with their crimes. Joseph DeAngelo believed he had committed the perfect crimes. For 40 years, he was right. He was meticulous, he was careful, and he was lucky. But his perfection was contingent on the scientific limitations of his era. He left behind a biological time bomb, a genetic witness that would wait patiently for decades until science was advanced enough to hear its story. The capture of the Golden State Killer is a testament to the relentless evolution of forensic science. It proves that no case is ever truly cold, and that no evidence is ever truly useless. A killer's most personal and permanent identifier, their DNA, can become their ultimate betrayal, turning their own family history into a roadmap for their capture. The perfect crime has a new and formidable enemy, the past itself, resurrected through science. Our next case moves from the cutting edge of DNA science back to one of the oldest and most controversial forms of forensic identification. It involves one of the most infamous and charismatic serial killers in history, a man whose charm was as deadly as his methods. We will examine the case of Ted Bundy and how the primitive, brutal imprint of his own teeth became the key piece of physical evidence that sent him to the electric chair. The name Ted Bundy is synonymous with the chilling dichotomy of charm and monstrosity. To the public, he was handsome, articulate, and intelligent, a former law student with a promising future. But beneath this polished veneer was a predator of unimaginable cruelty, a serial killer who confessed to at least 30 murders across 7 states in the 1970s, though the true number of his victims is likely much higher. Bundy was a master manipulator, not just of his victims, but of the legal system and the media. He was a chameleon, changing his appearance and methods to evade capture. He famously escaped from custody not once but twice, continuing his murderous rampage while a fugitive. His crimes were characterized by their brutality and his necrophiliac tendencies. He was the monster you would never suspect, the friendly stranger offering to help carry your books, the man with his arm in a fake cast asking for assistance. This ability to project an aura of safety and normalcy was the cornerstone of his perfect criminal persona. After his second escape from a Colorado jail in 1977, Bundy made his way to Florida. It was here, in a final, frenzied burst of violence, that he would make his most critical forensic mistake. On the night of January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. In a terrifying 15-minute blitz, he brutally attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. He then fled the sorority house and continued his rampage, attacking another student in her nearby apartment, leaving her for dead with severe injuries. The crime scene at the Chi Omega house was a scene of chaos and horror. Bundy had been careful, as usual. He wore gloves, and there were no clear fingerprints. There were no witnesses who could identify him. He had once again become a phantom, leaving behind a wake of destruction with no obvious trail leading back to him. But in his frenzied attack on Lisa Levy, Bundy had done something he had never done before. In a fit of savage rage, he had bitten her on her buttock. This act, born of pure animalistic fury, was a departure from his usually more controlled methods. It was an act of personal signature, and it would prove to be his undoing. At the time, the bite mark was just one of many horrific injuries, but a sharp-eyed medical examiner recognized its potential evidentiary value and had it photographed before the body was moved. Bundy was arrested a month later in Pensacola, Florida, after being stopped in a stolen car. He was a suspect in the Chi Omega murders, but the prosecution had a problem. They had no physical evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, the technology didn't exist yet, and no murder weapon. Their case was largely circumstantial. They needed a direct physical link between Ted Bundy and the body of Lisa Levy. That link was the bite mark. The prosecutors decided to build their case around a then controversial field of forensics, forensic odontology, the study of dental evidence. They believed that just as fingerprints are unique, so too are the impressions made by human teeth. They theorized that if they could match a mold of Ted Bundy's teeth to the photograph of the bite mark on Lisa Levy's body, they would have their smoking gun. The first step was to get a mold of Bundy's teeth. He was, predictably, uncooperative. He refused to open his mouth for the court-ordered dental impression, keeping his jaw clamped shut for hours. Eventually, the investigators had to obtain a second court order that authorized them to use whatever force was necessary. Finally, faced with the prospect of having his jaw forced open, Bundy relented, and the dental molds were made. Now, the prosecution needed an expert who could make the comparison and testify in court. They called upon Dr. Richard Souverin, a forensic odontologist from Miami. In what would become a landmark moment in legal history, Dr. Souverin took the stand. He used a large, clear photographic overlay of Bundy's dental impression and placed it over a life-sized photograph of the bite mark on Lisa Levy's body. The courtroom fell silent as he demonstrated the match for the jury. He pointed out the unique characteristics of Bundy's dentition, his chipped and crooked incisors, the precise alignment and misalignment of his teeth. One by one, he showed how these individual markers lined up perfectly with the indentations left on the victim's skin. He famously told the jury, "I've never seen a case where all of the characteristics were so profound and so obvious." His testimony was clear, visual, and devastatingly effective. For the first time, the jury had a tangible piece of evidence that placed Ted Bundy in direct, violent contact with the victim. It was a bridge across the circumstantial gap. The defense tried to discredit the evidence, arguing that bite mark analysis was a junk science, unreliable and subjective. And indeed, in the decades since the Bundy trial, forensic odontology has come under intense scrutiny, with many wrongful convictions being linked to its use. But in 1979, in that Florida courtroom, it was perceived as cutting-edge science. Bundy, who acted as his own co-counsel during the trial, seemed to understand the power of Dr. Souveron's testimony. His confident and arrogant demeanor, which had characterized much of the trial, began to falter. He had been outsmarted, not by a clever detective or a surprise witness, but by the unique imperfections of his own body. The charming smile he had used to lure his victims had become the very instrument of his conviction. In July 1979, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. He was sentenced to death. The bite mark evidence was the crucial piece of the puzzle that led to his conviction in the Chi Omega case. It was the first time in Florida's legal history, and one of the first times nationally, that a conviction had been secured on the basis of bite mark testimony. Bundy would later be convicted for the murder of a 12-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach, and would spend the next decade on death row before his execution in 1989. Ted Bundy's fatal mistake was a moment of uncontrolled rage. His perfect criminal methodology relied on a detached, organized approach. He was a planner, a hunter who prided himself on his intelligence and control. But in that sorority house, in the heat of his violent frenzy, he lost that control. He left a signature, not with a pen, but with his teeth. It was a primitive, visceral act, and it left a primitive, visceral piece of evidence. He had planned for fingerprints and witnesses, the standard concerns of a 1970s killer. He could never have anticipated that the unique architecture of his own jaw would be his downfall. He was betrayed by his own anatomy. The very tool he used to project an image of handsome normalcy was, in fact, as unique as a fingerprint, and it bore silent witness to his ultimate crime. The legacy of the Bundy case is complex. On one hand, it represents a moment where an innovative, at the time, forensic technique was used to convict one of history's most monstrous killers. On the other hand, it stands as a cautionary tale about the fallibility of certain forensic disciplines. The scientific community now widely acknowledges that bite mark analysis is highly subjective and lacks the rigorous validation of methods like DNA analysis. The National Academy of Sciences has been particularly critical, highlighting the potential for false positives and wrongful convictions. However, in the context of our exploration of perfect crime failures, the Bundy case is a powerful example of a criminal being undone by an unforeseen type of evidence. Bundy, the law student, the man who prided himself on his intellect, was caught because he failed to consider every possible way he could leave a trace of himself behind. He believed he could control the crime scene, but he could not control the rage that led him to leave an indelible and ultimately fatal impression. From a killer betrayed by his own body, we turn to a case of a man who tried to orchestrate the perfect crime by casting himself as the hero. This is a story not of a frenzied attack, but of a cold, calculated plot to commit murder and frame an innocent man. We will examine the case of Mark Winger and how his arrogant and persistent attempts to control the narrative after the crime led investigators to unravel his heroic alibi. On August 29, 1995, a frantic 911 call was made from the home of Mark and Donna Winger in Springfield, Illinois. On the line was Mark Winger, who told the dispatcher that he had just shot an intruder who was bludgeoning his wife to death with a hammer. When police arrived, they found a horrific scene. Donna Winger was lying on the floor, her head severely beaten. Nearby was the body of Roger Harrington, an airport shuttle driver who had been shot multiple times. A bloody hammer lay on the floor. Mark Winger, with minor injuries himself, presented a clear and compelling story. He claimed that he was in the basement when he heard his wife's screams. He grabbed his gun, ran upstairs, and found Harrington viciously attacking Donna with a hammer. Winger said he acted in self-defense and in defense of his wife, shooting Harrington to stop the assault. Tragically, he was too late to save Donna. On the surface, the case seemed open and shut. Winger was hailed as a tragic hero, a husband who had fought bravely to save his wife from a crazed attacker. The evidence appeared to support his story. Harrington had a history of mental health issues and had given Donna an unsettling ride home from the airport just days earlier, an incident she had reported to his employer. It seemed like a clear case of a disturbed individual stalking and attacking an innocent woman, with her husband intervening heroically. The police closed the case within days, ruling it a justifiable homicide. For Mark Winger, this was the perfect crime. He had not only murdered his wife, but had also eliminated a pre-selected patsy to take the blame. He had created a narrative so believable that he was met with sympathy and admiration instead of suspicion. He had inherited his wife's life insurance and was free to start a new life with his new girlfriend, who was, in fact, his children's nanny, whom he had been having an affair with for months. He had, it seemed, gotten away with it completely. But Mark Winger's fatal flaw was not a piece of misplaced evidence at the crime scene. It was his own insatiable arrogance and greed. He was not content with having gotten away with murder. He wanted more. A few years after the incident, Winger filed a civil lawsuit against the shuttle company that had employed Roger Harrington. He claimed the company was negligent in hiring Harrington and was therefore responsible for his wife's death. He was seeking a substantial financial settlement. This lawsuit was a monumental act of hubris, and it would be the catalyst for his downfall. The shuttle company, facing a major lawsuit, was not going to simply accept the police's version of events. They hired their own private investigators to look into the case. These investigators began to dig deeper into the lives of everyone involved, and they soon found inconsistencies in Winger's heroic tale. One of the first red flags was the nature of Winger's relationship with the family nanny, Deanne Schultz. He had married her just 5 months after his wife's murder. The investigators discovered that their affair had been going on long before Donna's death. This provided a powerful motive for the murder. Winger wanted his wife out of the way so he could be with his mistress without a costly and complicated divorce. The private investigators also re-examined the crime scene evidence, looking at it with fresh, skeptical eyes. They questioned the official narrative. Why would Harrington, a man with no history of violence, suddenly snap and commit such a brutal public attack? They re-interviewed witnesses and began to piece together a different timeline of events, one that suggested Harrington had been lured to the Winger home under false pretenses. The most crucial break in the case came from a source Mark Winger never could have anticipated: his former mistress and new wife, Deanne Schultz. The private investigators tracked her down. Their marriage had since fallen apart, and she was no longer under his control. In a series of interviews, she revealed the chilling truth behind the perfect crime. Schultz told the investigators that Winger had confessed to her. He had meticulously planned the entire event. He had intentionally hired Roger Harrington for a fake driving job, telling him to come to the house at a specific time. He had written a note, which he left in Harrington's car, making it seem like Harrington was obsessed with Donna. When Harrington arrived, Winger killed his wife Donna first, striking her with the hammer. He then waited for Harrington to enter the house, shot him, and placed the hammer in his hand to stage the scene. This confession completely reframed the investigation. The police, armed with this new information from the private inquiry, reopened the criminal case against Mark Winger. They now had a roadmap to deconstruct his carefully crafted lie. They brought in their own forensic experts to re-examine the physical evidence from the 1995 crime scene, which had been preserved. This new forensic analysis revealed stunning details that had been missed in the initial rushed investigation. A renowned bloodstain pattern analyst, Paulette Shatton, examined the crime scene photos and the physical evidence. She found that the blood spatter patterns were inconsistent with Winger's story. For example, there was a fine mist of blood on the back of Harrington's glasses, suggesting he was standing nearby when Donna was first struck, not actively attacking her. The blood on the hammer also told a different story. one of being placed in a dead man's hand rather than being used as a weapon by him. Furthermore, an analysis of the 911 call revealed something chilling. When the tape was enhanced, a faint voice could be heard in the background just before Winger starts speaking to the operator. The voice says, "Don't, Mark." It was believed to be the voice of his wife, Donna, in her final moments. This suggested that Winger was the aggressor and his wife was pleading with him, not with an intruder. In 2001, 6 years after he had been hailed as a hero, Mark Winger was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife, Donna Winger, and Roger Harrington. His trial in 2002 was a dramatic unraveling of his perfect crime. The prosecution laid out the evidence of his affair, his meticulous planning, and the forensic inconsistencies. His ex-wife, Deanne Schultz, testified against him, detailing his confession. The blood-stain pattern analyst and the audio expert presented their damning findings. Winger's defense was that he was the victim of a conspiracy, that his ex-wife was a scorned liar. But the weight of the evidence was too great. The jury saw through the facade of the grieving hero and saw the cold, calculating killer beneath. In May 2002, Mark Winger was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Mark Winger's fatal flaw was his unquenchable greed and arrogance. He had successfully committed a complex and deceptive crime. The initial police investigation had completely exonerated him. If he had simply been content with his freedom and his new life, he would have likely remained a free man. But he couldn't resist the temptation to profit further from his crime. The civil lawsuit was an act of profound overconfidence, a taunt to the system that he believed he had already beaten. He failed to understand that a civil lawsuit would trigger a level of scrutiny far beyond that of the original police inquiry. A multi-million-dollar corporation's legal team and their investigators had the resources and the motivation to tear his story apart, piece by piece. He invited the enemy into his carefully constructed house of lies, and they promptly burned it to the ground. This case is a powerful lesson in criminal psychology. It demonstrates how the same personality traits that allow a person to plan and execute a murder, narcissism, a sense of entitlement, and a belief in one's own superiority, are often the very traits that lead to their downfall. Winger saw himself as a puppet master, but his desire to pull one too many strings caused the entire production to collapse on top of him. It also highlights the importance of reinvestigation and the value of a fresh perspective. The initial investigators were likely influenced by the emotional drama of the scene and Winger's compelling performance as a grieving husband. They saw what they expected to see. The private investigators, free from this initial bias, were able to look at the evidence objectively and ask the questions that should have been asked from the very beginning. Mark Winger's perfect crime was perfect only as long as no one looked too closely. Our journey into the world of forensic missteps now takes us back in time to the dawn of a new era in criminal identification. We will explore a case that occurred over a century ago, a time when the idea of a perfect crime seemed far more attainable. This is the story of Thomas Jennings, a man who committed a murder in the dead of night, and the 3 faint, greasy fingerprints he left on a freshly painted railing that would change the course of legal history in the United States. In the early hours of September 19, 1910, the city of Chicago was a different world. Forensic science as we know it was in its embryonic stages. DNA was an unknown concept, and blood typing was still a new and experimental science. For a criminal operating under the cover of darkness, the chances of leaving a definitive, unarguable trace of their identity at a crime scene were slim. Eyewitness testimony, often unreliable, was the cornerstone of most criminal prosecutions. It was an environment ripe for the perfect crime. On that night, Clarence Hiller, a railroad clerk, was awakened by the screams of his wife and daughter in their home on 104th Street. He rushed to confront an intruder he found in his daughter's bedroom. A violent struggle ensued in the darkness. 2 shots rang out, and Hiller fell to the floor, killed by the intruder's bullets. The killer then fled, escaping into the night and seemingly vanishing without a trace. The police arrived to a chaotic scene. The Hiller family was in shock, unable to provide a clear description of the attacker they had only encountered in the dark. The investigation began, but with no witnesses and no obvious clues, the prospects of finding the killer seemed bleak. This was a typical scenario for the time, a nighttime home invasion that ended in tragedy, with a killer who had likely gotten away clean. However, the Hiller family had recently done some remodeling. A back porch railing had been freshly painted just hours before the home invasion. The paint was still soft and tacky. As the killer had entered the home through a window, he had steadied himself on this railing. In the soft, white paint, he had left a clear and perfect impression of 4 fingers from his left hand. In the era before fingerprinting became a standard investigative tool, the significance of this discovery might have been lost. But the Chicago Police Department was, at that time, one of the first in the nation to be experimenting with this new European science of fingerprint identification. Just a short distance from the Hiller home, another officer, responding to a different prowler call, encountered a man named Thomas Jennings. Jennings was acting suspiciously and had a fresh, bleeding wound on his arm. He was also carrying a loaded revolver. He was arrested for burglary and carrying a concealed weapon. At the time, there was nothing to directly connect him to the Hiller murder. At the police station, as part of their new experimental procedure, Jennings' fingerprints were taken. When an officer who had been at the Hiller crime scene saw the prints left in the wet paint, a revolutionary idea began to form. He compared the ink prints taken from Thomas Jennings at the station to the photographs of the prints left on the railing. The match was undeniable. The unique patterns of whorls, loops, and ridges were identical. For the first time in a major U.S. case, the police had a direct, physical link between a suspect and a murder scene, a link that did not rely on the fallible memory of an eyewitness. They had found their killer, not through a confession or a description, but through the silent, greasy testimony of his own fingertips. But finding the killer was only half the battle. Now they had to convince a court of law that this new, almost magical technique was a valid and reliable form of evidence. The trial of Thomas Jennings in 1911 became a landmark legal battle. The prosecution's entire case rested on the admissibility of fingerprint evidence. The defense attorneys argued vehemently that fingerprinting was a pseudoscience, an unproven and unreliable method of identification. They argued that it was no more credible than palm reading or fortune-telling. They claimed that the patterns were not unique and that the method was too new to be trusted with a man's life. To counter this, the prosecution brought in a team of experts, including officers from the Chicago Police Department's newly formed Identification Bureau and even a representative from the Leavenworth Prison, which had been using fingerprints for years to identify inmates. These experts testified about the science of fingerprinting, explaining the principles of permanence and individuality. They showed the jury enlarged photographs of the prints from the railing and the prints from Jennings, pointing out the numerous points of similarity. They explained how the friction ridges on our fingers are formed in the womb and remain unchanged throughout our lives, barring deep scarring. They detailed the classification system developed by Sir Francis Galton and Edward Henry, which allowed for the systematic analysis and comparison of prints. It was a crash course in a science that was completely foreign to the judge, the jury, and most of the legal world. The jury was convinced. They understood the simple, visual logic of the matching patterns. In November 1911, Thomas Jennings was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. The case was immediately appealed, with the defense's appeal based solely on the argument that the fingerprint evidence should never have been allowed in court. The case went all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. On December 21, 1911, the Illinois Supreme Court issued its historic ruling. It upheld the conviction of Thomas Jennings, and in doing so, it formally recognized fingerprint evidence as a legitimate and admissible form of scientific evidence in the United States legal system. The court's opinion stated that there was a scientific basis for the system of fingerprint identification and that it was a more reliable means of identification than the eyewitness testimony that had been used for centuries. Thomas Jennings was executed in February 1912. His crime, which in a slightly earlier era might have been the perfect, unsolvable murder, became the case that opened the floodgates for forensic science in America. His fatal mistake was a simple, thoughtless act of steadying himself on a freshly painted surface. He could not have known that he was leaving behind a permanent and irrefutable signature, a calling card that would not only lead to his own execution, but would also change the future of criminal investigation forever. This case is a powerful example of how the perfect crime is always a relative concept, defined by the technology of its time. Jennings' mistake was not a mistake in 1909. It became a fatal flaw in 1910 because the science of identification had taken a monumental leap forward. He was a victim of progress, a criminal whose methods had become obsolete overnight. He was caught not because he was careless by the standards of his day, but because the standards had changed without his knowledge. The Jennings case established the foundation upon which much of 20th century forensics was built. The humble fingerprint became the gold standard of physical evidence, the undisputed king of the crime scene. It gave investigators a powerful tool to link criminals to their crimes, a tool that was silent, impartial, and, at the time, considered infallible. It was the first major blow against the concept of the perfect crime, a clear demonstration that even the most fleeting contact could leave a permanent record. But as we will see, even the most revered scientific methods can be fallible, not because the science itself is flawed, but because the humans who collect and interpret it are. Our next case takes us to a picturesque Italian town where a brutal murder, a contaminated crime scene, and a rush to judgment led to a global media frenzy and a devastating miscarriage of justice. We will examine the case of Meredith Kercher's murder and the forensic failures that ruined the lives of Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito. In November 2007, the ancient walled city of Perugia, Italy, became the setting for a murder case that would capture the world's attention. Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old British exchange student, was found dead in her bedroom, her throat slashed. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the international cast of characters involved, created a perfect storm for a media sensation. The investigation that followed would become a textbook example of how flawed forensic procedures and cognitive bias can destroy the integrity of a case. The initial focus of the Italian police fell on Kercher's American roommate, Amanda Knox, and Knox's new Italian boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito. From the outset, the investigators seemed to be driven by a preconceived narrative. They envisioned a satanic ritual or a sex game gone wrong, and they began to selectively interpret evidence to fit this theory. This tunnel vision would lead to a series of catastrophic errors in the collection and analysis of forensic evidence. The crime scene itself, the cottage that Knox and Kercher shared, was severely compromised from the very beginning. In the critical hours and days after the body was discovered, basic crime scene protocols were repeatedly violated. Dozens of officers and personnel traipsed through the small apartment, many without proper protective gear like shoe covers or face masks. This created a high risk of cross-contamination, where DNA from one location or person could be inadvertently transferred to another. One of the most glaring examples of this was the handling of a bath mat in the bathroom adjacent to the murder scene. The bath mat, which had a bloody footprint on it, was a crucial piece of evidence. However, it was repeatedly moved and handled by different officers, and the crime scene was left unsecured for an extended period. This lack of control made it impossible to determine which traces were original to the crime and which were introduced by the investigators themselves. The forensic evidence that formed the core of the prosecution's case against Knox and Solicito was deeply flawed. The two key pieces of evidence were a kitchen knife found at Solicito's apartment and a bra clasp belonging to Meredith Kercher, which was discovered at the crime scene 46 days after the murder. Let's first consider the knife. The prosecution claimed this was the murder weapon, On the blade of the knife, forensic analysts found a tiny, barely visible trace of DNA that they claimed belonged to Meredith Kircher. On the handle, they found DNA belonging to Amanda Knox. This seemed like a smoking gun, a direct link between the suspects and the murder weapon. However, there were serious problems with this evidence. The amount of DNA attributed to Kircher on the blade was so small that it could not be reliably tested or replicated. It fell below the internationally accepted threshold for a valid DNA result. Independent experts who later reviewed the case argued that this tiny trace was more likely the result of contamination in the lab. The police's own forensic video showed an officer handling the knife with gloves that were visibly dirty, having been used to handle other evidence. The potential for transfer was enormous. Furthermore, the knife itself was not consistent with the wounds on Kircher's body. The supposed murder weapon had a 4-inch blade, but some of the victim's wounds were deeper than that. And most curiously, while the blade had a trace of the victim's DNA, it had no trace of her blood. It is nearly impossible to stab someone to death without leaving a significant amount of blood on the weapon. The evidence simply didn't make sense. Then there was the bra clasp. This piece of evidence, which had Solicito's DNA on it, was not found during the initial intensive searches of the crime scene. It was discovered a month and a half later in a different location in the room from where it was originally photographed. The defense argued that the clasp was likely moved and contaminated during the chaotic and poorly managed investigation. The DNA found on it could have been transferred from another object that Solicito had touched and which police had also handled. The collection of this bra clasp was itself a procedural disaster. A video of its collection showed officers using dirty gloves to pick it up, dropping it, and then placing it in an evidence bag that had been handled by multiple people. The chain of custody was a mess, and the potential for contamination was off the charts. Yet, this highly suspect piece of evidence became central to the prosecution's case against Solicito. In 2009, based on this shaky forensic evidence and a series of coerced and contradictory statements, Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito were convicted of murder. Knox was sentenced to 26 years in prison and Solicito to 25. The world was divided. Many believed the verdict was a just outcome for a brutal crime, while others saw it as a terrifying miscarriage of justice, fueled by a sensationalist media and a flawed investigation. The case did not end there. The convictions were appealed, and a new team of independent forensic experts was appointed to review the evidence. Their report, issued in 2011, was a scathing indictment of the original investigation. They concluded that the DNA evidence was unreliable and likely contaminated. They stated that the original investigators had failed to follow basic international protocols for evidence collection, and that no definitive conclusions could be drawn from the knife or the bra clasp. Based on this new report, an appeals court overturned the convictions in 2011, and Knox and Solicito were freed after spending 4 years in prison. However, in a bizarre turn of events, Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation, threw out the acquittal in 2013, ordering a new trial. Knox and Solicito were once again convicted in absentia in 2014. Finally, in 2015, the Court of Cassation definitively exonerated them, citing a complete lack of biological evidence connecting them to the crime and pointing to the glaring errors in the investigation. The true killer of Meredith Kircher was Rudy Guede, a drifter whose DNA and bloody fingerprints were found all over the crime scene. He had been convicted in a separate trial in 2008 and was serving a 16-year sentence. His presence at the scene was undeniable, yet the prosecution had insisted on pursuing their convoluted theory involving Knox and Solicito. The Amanda Knox case is not a story of a criminal's mistake. It is a story of the system's mistakes. The evidence failures in this case were not the subtle, microscopic oversights that usually undo a perfect crime. They were fundamental, procedural blunders that compromised the entire investigation from the start. The crime scene was treated not as a sacred space to be preserved, but as a chaotic hub of activity. Evidence was handled carelessly, stored improperly, and analyzed with a bias toward a predetermined conclusion. This case serves as a crucial cautionary tale in our exploration. It reminds us that forensic science is not magic. It is a tool, and its reliability is entirely dependent on the skill and integrity of the people using it. When a crime scene is contaminated, the evidence can no longer speak the truth. It begins to tell a confused and misleading story, a story that can point to the innocent just as easily as it can to the guilty. It demonstrates the danger of tunnel vision in an investigation. The police and prosecutors in Perugia became so wedded to their theory about Knox and Solicito that they ignored the overwhelming evidence pointing to Rudy Guede and misinterpreted the flimsy, contaminated evidence against the young couple. They were not seeking the truth, they were seeking to confirm their own narrative. The ultimate mistake in the Meredith Kercher case was a failure to respect the basic principles of forensic science. This failure not only led to the wrongful conviction of two innocent people who lost 4 years of their lives, but it also distracted from the clear guilt of the actual killer and did a profound disservice to the memory of the victim, Meredith Kercher. Her family was forced to endure years of legal battles and uncertainty, all because the evidence, which should have provided clear and simple answers, was irreparably corrupted. From a case destroyed by human error in the field, we turn to a case that was built on a foundation of fraudulent science in the lab. This is a story of a man who spent 13 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, convicted on the testimony of a so-called expert in a field that has since been largely discredited. We will examine the case of David Camm and the devastating impact of misread bloodstain patterns. On the evening of September 28, 2000, in Georgetown, Indiana, former state trooper David Camm returned home from playing basketball to discover a scene of unimaginable horror. In the garage of his home, he found his wife, Kim, and his 2 young children, Brad, age 7, and Jill, age 5, shot to death inside the family's Ford Bronco. The crime was brutal, senseless, and it shattered the tranquility of their small community. David Camm, the grieving husband and father, was immediately the primary suspect. This is standard procedure in such cases, but the investigation quickly developed a severe case of tunnel vision, focusing on Camm to the exclusion of all other possibilities. Investigators seized upon what they believed to be the key piece of physical evidence, a cluster of tiny, microscopic dots on the front of Camm's t-shirt. These dots, they claimed, were blood. The prosecution brought in a man named Rob Stites to analyze these supposed bloodstains. Stites presented himself as an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, a forensic discipline that seeks to interpret the shape, size, and distribution of bloodstains to reconstruct the events of a crime. He testified that the tiny dots on Camm's shirt were high-velocity impact spatter. This, he claimed, could only have been created by being in very close proximity to someone who was being shot. His testimony painted a damning picture. David Camm was not a grieving father who discovered the scene, he was the shooter. Based almost entirely on this expert testimony, David Camm was convicted of the murders of his wife and children in 2002 and sentenced to 195 years in prison. Camm maintained his innocence, insisting that the blood on his shirt must have gotten there when he tried to administer aid to his children, pulling his son from the car in a desperate attempt to see if he was still alive. But the jury believed the science. They believed the expert who told them the bloodstains told an irrefutable story of Camm's guilt. But the science and the expert were deeply flawed. After his conviction, Camm's defense team began to dig into Rob Stites' credentials. They discovered that he had grossly exaggerated his qualifications. He had no formal degree in science and had largely fabricated his resume. The expert who had sent a man to prison for life was a fraud. This discovery was shocking, but it was only the beginning of the unraveling of the case. Cam's defense team brought in legitimate, world-renowned bloodstain pattern analysts to review the evidence. These new experts came to a completely different conclusion. They testified that the stains on Cam's shirt were not high-velocity impact spatter. Instead, they were more consistent with transfer stains, which could have been created exactly as Cam had described, by his shirt coming into contact with his daughter's blood-soaked hair as he reached into the car. This new analysis cast serious doubt on the entire foundation of the prosecution's case. Cam's conviction was overturned and a new trial was ordered. However, the prosecution was not ready to give up. In the second trial, they doubled down, bringing in a new team of bloodstain experts who supported the original theory. Cam was convicted again in 2006. It seemed as though he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to overcome the powerful but misleading narrative created by a flawed forensic discipline. Throughout this ordeal, there was another piece of evidence from the crime scene that had been largely ignored by the prosecution. It was a gray prison-issue sweatshirt that had been found at the scene near the Bronco. The prosecution had dismissed it as irrelevant, a piece of trash. But Cam's defense team believed it was the key to finding the real killer. They had it tested for DNA. The DNA test revealed a stunning discovery. The sweatshirt contained the DNA of an unknown male who was not David Cam or any member of his family. The profile was run through the National DNA Database, CODIS, and it came back with a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Charles Bundy, a career criminal with a long and violent history. He was known in criminal circles by the nickname Backbone. This was the bombshell that should have exonerated David Cam immediately. The DNA of a known violent felon was found at the heart of the crime scene. The investigation revealed that Bundy had been released from prison shortly before the murders and had been staying with a relative nearby. He had a motive, as he had sold the murder weapon to Cam a few weeks earlier and likely returned to steal it back. The case against Bundy was strong. But in a shocking move, the prosecution once again refused to abandon their case against Cam. They concocted a new theory that David Cam and Charles Bundy had conspired together to murder Cam's family. There was absolutely no evidence to support this theory. The two men had no connection other than the single transaction for the gun. Yet, the prosecution proceeded with a third trial in 2013, charging both men with the murders. This third trial became a battle of the sciences. On one side was the prosecution, with its team of bloodstain pattern analysts arguing that their interpretation of the tiny dots on Cam's shirt was definitive proof of his guilt. On the other side was the defense, with its irrefutable DNA evidence linking a violent felon to the scene, and its own team of bloodstain experts who debunked the prosecution's claims. Charles Bundy, in a bid for a lighter sentence, agreed to testify against Cam, claiming they had planned it together. His story was riddled with inconsistencies and was clearly self-serving. Finally, after 13 years and 3 trials, the jury in the third trial saw the truth. They acquitted David Cam of all charges. They understood that the DNA evidence was hard, objective science, while the bloodstain pattern analysis, at least as it had been presented by the prosecution's witnesses, was a subjective interpretation that had been proven to be unreliable. Charles Bundy was convicted of the murders and sentenced to 225 years in prison. David Cam spent 13 years of his life in prison for a crime he did not commit, a crime in which he was the primary victim. The evidence mistake in his case was not a blunder by a criminal, but a catastrophic failure of the justice system, driven by the misapplication of forensic science. The field of bloodstain pattern analysis, while it can be a useful tool, is highly subjective and prone to interpreter bias. In this case, it was used not as a tool for objective inquiry, but as a weapon to confirm the investigators' initial suspicions about Cam. The case of David Cam is a stark warning about the dangers of junk science in the courtroom. It highlights a critical period in the history of forensics where certain disciplines, like bite mark analysis and, in some cases, bloodstain analysis, were presented to juries as infallible, when in fact they lacked rigorous scientific validation. The Innocence Project has shown that misapplied forensic science is a contributing factor in over half of all wrongful convictions. This case demonstrates the immense power of DNA evidence to cut through ambiguity and expose the truth. While the so-called experts argued over the meaning of a few tiny dots, the sweatshirt sat in an evidence locker holding the genetic signature of the real killer. It was a silent witness that was ignored for years because it didn't fit the prosecution's preferred narrative. David Camm's story is a tragedy of tunnel vision and the seductive power of a neat theory. The initial investigators made a mistake in judgment, and then the system spent over a decade defending that mistake rather than pursuing the actual evidence. The real fatal flaw was not on a t-shirt, but in the minds of those who chose to believe a flawed interpretation over cold, hard genetic fact. From the microscopic to the mundane, our next case shows that sometimes the clue that breaks a case isn't found under a microscope, but on a slip of paper left on a car's windshield. We journey to the terror-filled streets of New York City in the mid-1970s, to the hunt for the infamous Son of Sam, and the simple parking ticket that brought his reign of terror to an end. In the summer of 1976, a shadow fell over New York City. A killer was stalking the streets, seemingly at random, targeting young women with long dark hair and couples in parked cars. He used a powerful .44 caliber bulldog revolver, a weapon that earned him the nickname the .44 caliber killer. The attacks were sudden, brutal, and terrifyingly unpredictable. The city was plunged into a state of fear unlike any it had ever known. The killer began to communicate with the police and the media, leaving behind taunting, rambling letters signed Son of Sam. He claimed to be commanded by his neighbor's dog, which he said was possessed by a demon. These letters transformed the case from a series of anonymous shootings into a city-wide psychodrama. The killer was not just a murderer, he was a media personality, a monster who was playing a game with the entire city. For over a year, the NYPD conducted one of the largest and most intense manhunts in its history. The Son of Sam task force grew to over 300 detectives. They pursued thousands of leads, interviewed countless suspects, and explored every possible angle, from organized crime hits to a satanic cult. But the killer was a ghost. His attacks were geographically scattered across the boroughs of Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, and he left behind no fingerprints or useful forensic evidence, other than the .44 caliber slugs from his gun. The perfect aspect of his crime spree was its randomness. There was no apparent connection between the victims, no clear motive other than a desire to create chaos and fear. He was a predator who hunted in the vast urban jungle of New York, striking and then melting back into the city's population of 8 million people. The lack of a discernible pattern made him incredibly difficult to profile and to track. The city was on edge. Women with dark hair dyed it blonde. Nightclubs and discotheques, once symbols of the city's vibrant nightlife, emptied out. The streets grew quiet after dark. The pressure on the police was immense. The media, fueled by the killer's letters, fanned the flames of public panic. The Son of Sam had the city under his spell. The final attack occurred on July 31, 1977. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante were sitting in a parked car in a Brooklyn lover's lane when the killer approached, fired several shots into the car, and fled. Stacy Moskowitz was killed and Robert Violante was severely injured, losing sight in one eye. It was another tragic and seemingly random act of violence. But this time, the killer had made a small, almost insignificant mistake. As the killer fled the scene, a local resident named Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog. She saw a man get into a car and speed away. She also noticed something else. Just before the shooting, a police officer had been ticketing cars that were illegally parked in front of a fire hydrant on her street. She remembered seeing the man who fled the scene get into one of those cars, a cream-colored Ford Galaxy. When she reported this to the police, it was just one of hundreds of tips they received in the days following the Moskowitz murder. But this tip was different. It provided a new, tangible avenue of investigation. Detectives had a specific type of car and a specific location. They decided to check all the parking tickets that had been issued in that neighborhood on the night of the murder. This was a painstaking manual process. They had to sift through stacks of handwritten tickets, looking for any that had been issued to a cream-colored Ford Galaxy or similar vehicle. And then they found it. A single ticket issued at 2:40 a.m., just a short time before the shooting, to a 1970 Ford Galaxy. The ticket had been issued on the very street where Cecilia Davis had seen the man get into his car. The car was registered to a man named David Berkowitz, who lived in the nearby city of Yonkers. Detectives immediately began to investigate him. They discovered that Berkowitz was a 24-year-old postal worker, a quiet loner who lived by himself in an apartment. He had no serious criminal record, but a search of his background revealed he had a history of unsettling behavior, including setting small fires and sending disturbing letters to his neighbors. The pieces started to fit. Yonkers detectives recalled a complaint from a man named Sam Carr, who claimed that his neighbor, David Berkowitz, had shot his dog. Berkowitz had sent Carr a series of harassing letters, some of which were eerily similar in tone and handwriting to the Son of Sam letters. The name Son of Sam suddenly had a possible origin. On August 10, 1977, detectives staked out Berkowitz's apartment building in Yonkers. They saw the cream-colored Ford Galaxy parked outside. As Berkowitz left the building and got into his car, they approached him. Detective John Falatico put his gun to Berkowitz's head and said, "Now I've got you." Berkowitz's response was chillingly calm. He smiled and said, "Well, you got me. What took you so long?" Inside his car, they found a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver, the same type of weapon used in all the shootings. They also found a duffel bag containing ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and another taunting letter addressed to the police. The year-long reign of terror was over. The monster who had held a city captive was in custody. David Berkowitz's fatal flaw was a mundane and common annoyance of city life, a parking ticket. In the midst of planning and executing a murder, of orchestrating a campaign of terror, he had made a simple, careless mistake. He had parked his car in front of a fire hydrant. This single, banal error provided the police with the one thing they had been desperately lacking for over a year, a direct, physical link to a name and an address. His perfect crime was predicated on anonymity and randomness. As long as he was a nameless face in the crowd, he was untouchable. But the parking ticket stripped him of that anonymity. It attached his name to a specific place at a specific time, just minutes before and blocks away from his final murder. It was a bureaucratic breadcrumb that led the police directly to his door. This case is a classic example of how investigations are often solved not by a single eureka moment of brilliant deduction, but by the patient and methodical work of following up on every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The tip from the eyewitness was crucial, but it was the decision to meticulously search through the parking tickets that cracked the case. It was good old-fashioned police work, combined with a lucky break. It also underscores the role of chance and circumstance in the unraveling of a criminal plan. If Cecilia Davis hadn't decided to walk her dog at that exact moment, if the patrol officer hadn't been diligent about ticketing illegally parked cars that night, Berkowitz might have driven away from his final murder as anonymously as he had from all the others. The perfect crime is often just a crime that has been lucky. Berkowitz's luck simply ran out. The Son of Sam case reminds us that a criminal, no matter how cunning or terrifying, is still a human being, subject to the same mundane mistakes and oversights as anyone else. In his mind, David Berkowitz was a demonic mastermind, a historical figure locked in an epic battle with the police. In reality, he was a man who got a parking ticket. And that simple human error was all it took to bring his monstrous fantasy crashing down. From a mistake of convenience, we turn to a mistake born of panic. Our next case involves a prolific serial killer whose downfall came during a routine traffic stop. A stop that escalated into a high-speed chase and ended with the discovery of his final victim. We will look at the capture of Joel Rifkin and how a missing license plate on his pickup truck brought his long and gruesome killing spree to a sudden end. Joel Rifkin is one of the most prolific serial killers in New York's history, though he is not as infamous as some of his contemporaries. He was not a theatrical, taunting killer like the Son of Sam. He was a quiet, unassuming landscaper from Long Island, a man described by those who knew him as awkward and unremarkable. But behind this bland exterior was a predator who, by his own confession, murdered 17 women between 1989 and 1993. Rifkin preyed on vulnerable women, mostly prostitutes and drug users in New York City. His method was brutal and direct. He would pick them up, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies, scattering the remains in various locations across the New York metropolitan area. He was a creature of grim routine, a killer who treated murder as a gruesome but manageable part of his life. For 4 years, he operated with chilling success. The perfect aspect of his crimes lay in the anonymity of his victims and the disposal of their bodies. Many of his victims were from transient populations, their disappearances not immediately noticed or reported. By dismembering the bodies and scattering the parts, he made identification incredibly difficult, and in some cases, impossible. He was a ghost preying on ghosts, a killer whose crimes were often reduced to a series of unsolved Jane Doe cases. He was forensically aware to a degree. He would wrap the bodies in plastic or canvas and was careful about cleaning his mother's car, which he often used, and his own pickup truck. He managed to avoid leaving traceable evidence that could link the various crime scenes and body parts back to a single killer, let alone to him specifically. For 4 years, he was a one-man plague, operating completely under the radar of law enforcement. But the strain of his double life and the sheer logistical nightmare of his murderous activities was beginning to take its toll. His crimes became sloppier, his methods more reckless. The grim routine was becoming unsustainable. The end came not as a result of a brilliant piece of detective work or a forensic breakthrough, but because of a simple, almost comically mundane traffic violation. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1993, 2 New York State police troopers were on patrol on the Southern State Parkway on Long Island. They spotted a Mazda pickup truck driving without a rear license plate. This was a routine traffic violation, the kind of stop they made dozens of times a week. They pulled in behind the truck and switched on their lights and siren. For a normal driver, this would be a moment of annoyance, the prelude to a ticket. For Joel Rifkin, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. In the back of his pickup truck, under a blue tarp, was the decomposing body of his 17th and final victim, a prostitute named Tiffany Brashani. He had killed her a few days earlier and was on his way to dispose of her body when the troopers tried to pull him over. Rifkin made a fateful decision. Instead of pulling over and trying to bluff his way through the stop, he hit the gas. He led the troopers on a high-speed chase, weaving through traffic on the parkway at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. The chase continued for over 20 minutes, a frantic and desperate attempt to escape what he knew was the inevitable. The chase finally ended when Rifkin lost control of his truck and crashed into a utility pole in front of the Nassau County Courthouse in Myola. As the troopers approached the wrecked vehicle, they were hit by a powerful and sickeningly sweet odor. It was the unmistakable smell of human decomposition. Their routine traffic stop had just turned into something far more sinister. When they looked in the back of the truck, under the tarp, they found the body of Tiffany Brashani.
Joel Rifkin was arrested on the spot. His 4-year reign of terror was over, brought to an end by a missing license plate and the resulting panic-fueled flight. Once in custody, Rifkin quickly began to confess. Over the next few days, he calmly and methodically detailed his 16 other murders, providing investigators with information that would allow them to link him to numerous unsolved cases and unidentified remains.
He led them to the locations where he had dumped bodies, and he provided details about the victims that only the killer could have known. The quiet landscaper from Long Island was unmasked as one of the state's most prolific and brutal serial killers. The investigation into his life revealed a history of social awkwardness, obsession with prostitutes, and a deep-seated rage that he had managed to conceal from everyone, including his own family with whom he lived. Joe Rifkin's fatal flaw was a combination of carelessness and panic. The initial mistake, driving without a license plate, was a small but critical act of sloppiness. In his increasingly chaotic state, he had overlooked a basic detail that made his vehicle a target for police attention. He had spent years trying to be invisible, but on that final night, he was driving a truck that was practically begging to be pulled over. The second mistake, the decision to flee, was a catastrophic miscalculation born of pure terror. If he had pulled over, it is possible, though perhaps unlikely, that he could have talked his way out of a search of his truck bed. But by initiating a high-speed chase, he guaranteed that his vehicle and its contents would be subject to the highest level of scrutiny. His flight was an admission of guilt, a screaming red flag to the troopers that this was no ordinary traffic stop. This case illustrates how even the most practiced and prolific killers are not immune to making basic, foolish errors, especially when they are under pressure. Rifkin's perfect system of murder and disposal was, by its very nature, a high-stress, high-risk enterprise. It was only a matter of time before he made a mistake. The law of averages was against him. The more he killed, the more opportunities he created for a chance encounter, a random event, to bring his secret world crashing down. The capture of Joel Rifkin was not a triumph of forensic science or criminal profiling. It was a triumph of routine, diligent police work. The troopers were not looking for a serial killer. They were looking for a traffic violation. But by doing their job, by paying attention to a small detail like a missing license plate, they stumbled upon a monster. It is a powerful reminder that the foundation of effective law enforcement is often not the glamorous high-tech investigation, but the consistent and thorough application of basic procedures. Rifkin's crimes were perfect only in their obscurity. He was able to get away with them for so long because his victims were marginalized, and his methods of disposal were effective at erasing their identities. But his system was not foolproof. It was a fragile illusion that could be shattered by the most mundane of circumstances. In the end, it was not his brutality or his cunning that defined his story, but the simple, ignominious fact that he was caught because he forgot to put a license plate on his truck. Our exploration of fatal flaws now takes us across the Atlantic and back in time to a case that unfolded at the dawn of a new technology that would change the world, the wireless telegraph. This is the story of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, a mild-mannered American doctor living in London, whose meticulous plan to murder his wife and escape with his lover was foiled by the invisible waves of radio, making him the first criminal to be captured via wireless communication. In 1910 London, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was a homeopath and patent medicine marketer, a seemingly respectable but ultimately unremarkable man. He was married to Cora Turner, a flamboyant and aspiring music hall singer who went by the stage name Belle Elmore. Their marriage was a tumultuous one, marked by Cora's infidelity and extravagant spending, and Crippen's long-simmering resentment. Crippen, meanwhile, was having an affair with his young typist, Ethel Leneve. By early 1910, Crippen had decided he wanted a new life with Ethel. But divorce was a scandalous and financially ruinous prospect in Edwardian England. So he devised what he believed was the perfect plan to eliminate his wife. He purchased a large quantity of the toxic alkaloid hyoscine, a poison that was difficult to trace at the time. He then poisoned his wife, dismembered her body, and buried her remains in the coal cellar of their home at 39 Hilldrop Crescent. To explain his wife's sudden disappearance, Crippen concocted a series of elaborate lies. He told her friends that she had returned to America to care for a sick relative. When they grew more suspicious, he changed his story, claiming that she had tragically died and been cremated in California. He even placed a death notice in the newspaper. For a time, the deception worked. Crippen and his lover, Ethel Leneve, began to live openly as a couple. Ethel even started wearing Cora's jewelry and furs. This brazen behavior, however, raised the suspicions of Cora's friends. One of them, a former strongman named Volcana, went to Scotland Yard. Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to the case. Dew interviewed Crippen, who stuck to his story about his wife's death in America. Crippen was calm, cooperative, and believable. Dew was initially satisfied with his explanation and was prepared to close the case. This was the moment Crippen's perfect crime was on the verge of success. But Crippen made a classic criminal's mistake. He panicked. Despite having seemingly convinced the police, the very fact that he was being investigated terrified him. He and Ethel Leneve decided to flee. They hastily packed their bags, and on July 9, 1910, they disappeared. This sudden flight was a massive red flag for Inspector Dew. If Crippen's story was true, why would he run? Dew immediately returned to 39 Hilldrop Crescent and ordered a thorough search of the house. After 4 days of searching, the grim discovery was made. Buried under the brick floor of the coal cellar was a mass of human remains. The head, limbs, and bones had been removed, making identification impossible by the standards of the day. But what remained was a large section of torso. A pathologist, Bernard Spilsbury, examined the remains and found a crucial clue: a scar consistent with an abdominal surgery that Cora Crippen was known to have had. He also found traces of hyoscine in the tissue, confirming the cause of death was poison. Now the case was a full-blown murder hunt, and Dr. Crippen was the most wanted man in Britain. But he and Ethel Leneve had a significant head start. They had fled to Brussels and then to Antwerp, where they booked passage on the SS Montrose, a steamship bound for Canada. To avoid detection, they traveled under the names Mr. John Philo Robinson and Son. Crippen was the father, and Ethel, dressed as a boy, was the son. They believed that once they reached Canada, they could disappear into the vastness of North America and start their new life. This is where Crippen's meticulously planned escape ran headlong into the marvel of modern technology. The captain of the SS Montrose, Henry George Kendall, was an observant man. He took notice of the strange Mr. Robinson and his son. Their overly affectionate behavior and the fact that the boys' trousers were ill-fitting, revealing the shape of a woman's hips, aroused his suspicion. He had been reading the newspapers about the sensational Crippen case, and he began to suspect that his 2 passengers were the fugitives. In a previous era, Captain Kendall's suspicions would have been useless. By the time the ship reached Canada, Crippen and Leneve would have been long gone. But the SS Montrose was equipped with a new and revolutionary piece of technology, a Marconi wireless telegraph. On July 22, 1910, Captain Kendall composed a discreet message and gave it to his wireless operator. The message, sent out in Morse code over the invisible airwaves, read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are amongst saloon passengers." This message was picked up by the receiving station in England. It was the first time the wireless had ever been used to track and apprehend a fugitive at sea. The news created a media sensation. Scotland Yard's Inspector Dew, armed with this incredible new information, immediately booked passage on a faster ship, the SS Laurentic, which left a day after the Montrose but was scheduled to arrive in Quebec before it. The chase was on, and the whole world was watching, reading the daily wireless updates from the 2 ships in their newspapers. Crippen and Leneve, meanwhile, were oblivious. They spent the transatlantic journey believing they were safe, enjoying their newfound freedom. They had no idea that their every move was being reported to the world and that the law was literally outsailing them. On July 31, 1910, as the SS Montrose sailed up the St. Lawrence River, a pilot boat came alongside. A man dressed as a pilot climbed aboard. It was Inspector Dew. He approached the stunned Dr. Crippen and said, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen's escape was over.
Dr. Crippen was returned to London to stand trial. The forensic evidence presented by Bernard Spilsbury, particularly the identification of the scar tissue and the presence of the poison, was crucial. Crippen was found guilty of murder and was hanged in November 1910. Ethel Leneve was acquitted of being an accessory. Dr. Crippen's fatal flaw was his underestimation of the pace of technological change. His escape plan was an analog plan in a world that was rapidly becoming digital, or at least wireless. He had planned for the physical world of disguises and false names, but he was completely unprepared for the invisible world of radio waves. He had successfully put an entire ocean between himself and the law, but he could not escape the reach of the wireless telegraph. His initial mistake, of course, was the panic that led him to flee in the first place. If he had remained calm and stayed in London, it's possible Inspector Dew would have never ordered the cellar, and the crime might have remained perfect. But his flight, combined with the power of this new communication technology, created a perfect storm that ensured his capture. The Crippen case was a global phenomenon. It was the first trial of the century, followed by millions around the world through the newspapers. It cemented the public's fascination with the idea of the scientific detective and showcased the power of new technology in the fight against crime. It was a clear message to the criminal underworld. The world was getting smaller. There were fewer and fewer places to hide. Just as the Thomas Jennings case demonstrated the power of the fingerprint, the Crippen case demonstrated the power of communication. It marked a turning point where the speed of information began to outpace the speed of a fugitive. Dr. Crippen's meticulously planned new life was short-circuited by a series of dots and dashes flying invisibly through the air, a technological betrayal he could never have imagined. From a man caught by the technology of the future, we turn to a man who tried to cheat the most powerful forensic technology of his time. This is the story of the first murderer ever to be convicted using DNA fingerprinting, a case that began with a clever deception but ended with the birth of a new era in criminal justice. We will examine the case of Colin Pitchfork and the world's first DNA dragnet. In the mid-1980s, the small villages of Narborough and Enderby in Leicestershire, England, were gripped by fear. In 1983, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Linda Mann was raped and murdered while walking home. The crime was brutal and left the local community in shock. The police investigation was extensive, but with no witnesses and few clues, the case went cold. The killer, it seemed, had vanished. 3 years later, in 1986, terror struck the community again. Another 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, was found raped and murdered in a wooded area. The circumstances were strikingly similar to the Linda Mann case. The police were almost certain that the two murders were the work of the same man. This time, however, they had a new scientific tool at their disposal, a technique so new it had never been used in a criminal investigation before. The technique was called DNA fingerprinting, and it had been developed just 2 years earlier, in 1984, by a geneticist at the nearby University of Leicester named Alec Jeffreys. Jeffreys had discovered that certain regions of our DNA contain sequences that are repeated over and over again, and that the number of these repetitions varies dramatically from one individual to another. He developed a method to visualize these variations as a pattern of bands, like a barcode. This DNA fingerprint was, he claimed, unique to every individual, with the exception of identical twins.
Police approached Jeffries and asked if his new technique could help their investigation. They had collected semen samples from both murder scenes. If the DNA fingerprints from both samples matched, it would prove the two murders were committed by the same person. And if they could find a suspect, they could compare his DNA to the crime scene samples for a definitive match. The analysis was done, and it confirmed their suspicions. The same man had killed both Linda Mann and Don Ashworth. Now they had a genetic profile of the killer. The problem was they had no one to match it to. The prime suspect in the Don Ashworth murder was a 17-year-old kitchen porter named Richard Buckland who had learning difficulties. Under intense police questioning, Buckland confessed to the Ashworth murder, though he denied any involvement in the Mann case. To the police, it seemed they had their man. They asked Alec Jeffries to compare Buckland's DNA to the crime scene samples, expecting it to be the final nail in his coffin. The results were a bombshell. Richard Buckland's DNA did not match the DNA from the crime scenes. He was innocent. In a historic moment, DNA evidence was used not to convict a suspect, but to exonerate one. The police were back at square one. They had the killer's DNA, but they had no idea who he was. This led them to a radical and unprecedented idea: a DNA dragnet. They decided to ask every single male resident of the three villages between the ages of 17 and 34 to voluntarily provide a blood or saliva sample for DNA testing. It was a monumental undertaking. Over 5,000 men were asked to participate. The police believed that the killer, faced with the inevitability of being caught, would either refuse to give a sample, thus identifying himself, or would be caught when his sample was tested. For months, the DNA screening went on. Sample after sample was tested, and none of them matched the killer's profile. The police were growing frustrated. It seemed their innovative plan was a failure. The killer, they reasoned, must have slipped through the net somehow. He had to be someone who had a reason to avoid the testing, perhaps someone with a prior criminal record, or someone who had recently moved away. This is where the killer, a local baker named Colin Pitchfork, made his fatal mistake. Pitchfork was a married father of two, a seemingly ordinary man, but he was also a sexual predator and a double murderer. He knew that if he provided a DNA sample, he would be caught. So he devised what he thought was a clever plan to cheat the system. He approached a coworker, Ian Kelly, and confessed to him that he had already given a sample while posing as someone else to help a friend avoid trouble with his wife. He then persuaded Kelly to take the DNA test for him. He gave Kelly a forged passport for identification and a sob story about how he was worried about a past conviction for indecent exposure coming to light. Kelly, feeling sorry for his friend and not understanding the true stakes, agreed. He went to the testing center, presented Pitchfork's forged documents, and provided a sample of his own blood in Pitchfork's name. Colin Pitchfork believed he had committed the perfect deception. He had beaten the world's first DNA dragnet, but his hubris would be his downfall. A few months later, in a pub, Ian Kelly's coworker, the one he had bragged to about the scheme, overheard another conversation about the DNA testing. His conscience got the better of him. He realized the potential seriousness of what Kelly had done and went to the police. He told them the story of how Ian Kelly had taken the test on behalf of his friend, Colin Pitchfork. The police immediately knew they had their man. The name Colin Pitchfork had never even been on their list of suspects. On September 19, 1987, they arrested him. They took a DNA sample, and this time it was sent to Alec Jeffries' lab for comparison. The result was a perfect match to the DNA from the murders of both Linda Mann and Don Ashworth. The barcode had found its owner. Faced with the irrefutable scientific evidence, Colin Pitchfork confessed to both rapes and murders. In January 1988, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. He became the first person in the world to be convicted of murder based on DNA fingerprinting. The case was a watershed moment in the history of criminal justice. It was the birth of the DNA era. Colin Pitchfork's fatal flaw was his belief that he could outsmart a system he didn't fully understand. He saw the DNA dragnet as a simple identity check, a roll call that he could circumvent with a substitute. He failed to grasp the fundamental power of the technology. It wasn't just about finding a name on a list, it was about finding a unique biological signature. By asking someone else to take the test for him, he created a new trail of evidence, a human witness to his deception. His mistake was compounded by his arrogance. He couldn't keep his clever plan to himself. He had to boast about it, which led to the conversation that was overheard in the pub. Like so many criminals before and after him, his ego wrote a check that his intellect couldn't cash. He had successfully evaded the scientific net, but he was caught in the much older and more common net of human gossip. This case is a perfect illustration of an arms race. The police deployed a revolutionary new weapon, and the criminal devised a clever countermeasure. But the criminal's countermeasure had a fatal weakness, one that the police were able to exploit. It proved that no matter how advanced the science becomes, investigations often still hinge on the oldest techniques in the book. A tip from an informant, a guilty conscience, a loose tongue. The legacy of the Colin Pitchfork case is immeasurable. It validated DNA fingerprinting as the most powerful tool in the forensic arsenal. It led to the creation of national DNA databases around the world, which have been used to solve countless crimes and exonerate thousands of wrongfully convicted individuals. The perfect crime of leaving no traditional evidence was rendered obsolete. From this point forward, every criminal had to contend with the fact that they were leaving behind an invisible, undeniable, and permanent calling card at every scene, their own genetic code. From a case that hinged on a groundbreaking scientific discovery, we turn to one that was unraveled by a series of mundane, everyday transactions. This is a story of a man who tried to create the perfect alibi for his wife's disappearance, but whose digital and paper trail told a story of cold, calculated murder. We will examine the case of Scott Peterson and the overlooked receipt that exposed his lies. On Christmas Eve 2002, Lossie Peterson, who was 8 months pregnant with her first child, disappeared from her home in Modesto, California. Her husband, Scott Peterson, told police that he had last seen her that morning as she was preparing to walk their dog. He claimed he had gone fishing for the afternoon at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away. When he returned home that evening, he said, Lossie was gone. A massive search was launched, and the case quickly became a national media obsession. Scott Peterson played the role of the concerned, grieving husband. He gave television interviews, appealing for his wife's safe return. He appeared to be cooperating with the police. On the surface, his story was plausible, if a little unusual for Christmas Eve. He had an alibi. He was miles away at the marina. There was no sign of a struggle at the home, no ransom note, no clear evidence of foul play. For a time, it was treated as a missing person case. But from the beginning, investigators and the public were suspicious of Scott Peterson's behavior. His demeanor in interviews seemed strangely detached and unemotional. He was evasive about certain details of his story. And within weeks of his wife's disappearance, a shocking revelation came to light. Scott Peterson had been having a long-term affair with a woman named Amber Frey. He had told Frey that he was a widower, that he had lost his wife weeks before Lacey actually disappeared. This revelation provided a powerful motive for murder, but it was still circumstantial. The police needed physical evidence to connect Scott to Lossie's disappearance. They began to meticulously deconstruct his alibi and his activities in the days and weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. They were looking for the cracks in his perfect story, the small details that didn't add up. And they found them, not in a dramatic forensic discovery, but in the mundane paper and digital trail of his everyday life. One of the most critical pieces of evidence was a simple receipt. Police discovered that on December 20th, just 4 days before Lossie disappeared, Scott Peterson had purchased a 2-day fishing license. This might seem insignificant, but the timing was crucial. Why would a man who claimed his fishing trip was a spontaneous decision suddenly buy a license just days before his wife vanished? It suggested forethought and planning. But the truly damning discovery was what else he had purchased. Investigators learned that 2 weeks before Lacey's disappearance, Scott Peterson had bought a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat. He had bought it with cash, and he had told the seller it was for a hunting trip. He had kept the boat a secret from his wife, his family, and his friends. This secret boat, combined with the secret fishing license, began to paint a very dark picture of premeditation. Police then began to analyze Scott's computer and cell phone records, the digital breadcrumbs of his life. They found that in the weeks leading up to Lacey's disappearance, he had conducted a series of suspicious internet searches. He had researched boat launch ramps in the San Francisco Bay, specifically near the Berkeley Marina, where he claimed to have gone fishing. He had also searched for information on currents, tides, and wind patterns in the bay. This was not the behavior of a man planning a casual afternoon of fishing. This was the behavior of a man planning how to dispose of a body in a large body of water, hoping the currents would carry it out to sea, never to be found. His alibi, which he thought was his shield, was becoming the very evidence that condemned him. He had chosen a location not for the fish, but for its depth and currents. Further investigation revealed more inconsistencies. He claimed to have been fishing for sturgeon, but he had brought the wrong type of lure. The boat he bought was ill-suited for the rough waters of the bay. His entire story was a poorly constructed facade, and the more investigators picked at it, the more it fell apart. Then, in April 2003, 4 months after Lassie's disappearance, the horrific discovery was made. The torso of a woman and the body of a full-term male fetus washed ashore in the San Francisco Bay, just a few miles from where Scott Peterson had been fishing. DNA testing confirmed the remains were those of Lassie Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location of the discovery was the final, devastating link in the chain of evidence. Scott Peterson was arrested a few days later near the Mexican border. He had dyed his hair, grown a goatee, and was carrying nearly $15,000 in cash. He was clearly preparing to flee the country. His carefully constructed image as the grieving husband had been completely shattered. At his trial in 2004, the prosecution laid out the mountain of circumstantial evidence. They presented the story of the affair, the secret boat, the fishing license, the internet searches, and the location where the bodies were found. There was no single smoking gun piece of forensic evidence, no murder weapon, no confession. The case was a mosaic of small lies and suspicious actions. But when pieced together, they created an overwhelming picture of guilt. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was a single hair belonging to Lacey that was found on a pair of pliers in Scott's boat. It was a tiny, almost insignificant trace, but it placed Lacey, or at least a part of her, in the boat that he had kept secret from her. The defense argued that it could have been transferred from his clothing, but for the jury, it was another piece of the puzzle that fit perfectly. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife and the second-degree murder of their unborn son. He was sentenced to death. Scott Peterson's fatal flaw was his belief that he could create a false reality through lies. He thought that if he simply said he was fishing, that would be the truth. He failed to understand that in the modern world, every action, every purchase, every click of a mouse leaves a trace. He was trying to commit a 19th century-style crime, a simple disappearance, in a 21st century world of data and surveillance. His perfect alibi was, in fact, a self-incriminating roadmap of his crime. Every step he took to build the alibi, buying the boat, getting the license, researching the location, became a piece of evidence against him. He was so focused on creating the story for the day of the murder that he failed to consider how his preparations in the weeks prior would look to investigators. This case highlights the power of circumstantial evidence. While a single piece of evidence, like the fishing license or an internet search, might be explained away, the cumulative weight of dozens of such pieces can become undeniable. It's the death by 1,000 cuts theory of prosecution. Scott Peterson didn't make one catastrophic mistake. He made a series of small, arrogant ones, each one adding another thread to the web that would eventually ensnare him. He underestimated the power of mundane data. A receipt, a cell phone ping, a search history. These are the building blocks of modern investigations. Scott Peterson thought he was creating a secret life, but he was actually creating a detailed, time-stamped log of his own guilt. His attempt to build the perfect alibi ended up being the perfect blueprint for his own prosecution. From the paper trail of a receipt, we move to the microscopic trail of a single fiber. Our next case takes us to Atlanta, Georgia, during a period of terror that targeted the city's most vulnerable, its children. We will examine the Atlanta child murders and how the nascent science of fiber analysis provided the crucial, though controversial, link that brought the killings to an end. Between 1979 and 1981, the city of Atlanta was in the grip of a terrifying crisis. A string of murders was occurring, with the victims being almost exclusively African American children, adolescents, and young adults. At least 28 victims were linked to the case, which became known as the Atlanta child murders. The city was in a state of panic and racial tension. A massive task force was assembled, involving local, state, and federal law enforcement, including the FBI. The killer was a ghost. The victims were abducted and murdered, their bodies often dumped in wooded areas or in the Chattahoochee River. The causes of death varied, with some victims being strangled, others stabbed or beaten. The lack of a consistent MO and the absence of traditional forensic evidence like fingerprints or witnesses made the case incredibly difficult. The killer seemed to be operating with impunity, creating a sense of helplessness and rage in the community. The perfect nature of these crimes lay in their elusiveness and the vulnerability of the victims. The killer was preying on children from low-income neighborhoods, individuals whose disappearances might not trigger the same immediate and massive response as those from more affluent areas. The disposal of the bodies in remote locations also limited the amount of evidence that could be recovered. The turning point in the investigation came from a strategic shift. Investigators noticed that several of the victims had been recovered from the Chattahoochee River. They reasoned that the killer was likely dumping the bodies from one of the many bridges that crossed the river. The task force decided to stake out all 14 bridges, a massive surveillance operation that went on for weeks. In the early morning hours of May 22, 1981, a surveillance team stationed at the James Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a loud splash in the water below. Moments later, they saw a white Chevrolet station wagon drive off the bridge. They stopped the car and identified the driver as a 23-year-old freelance photographer and music promoter named Wayne Williams. They questioned him, but since they had not actually seen him throw anything from the bridge and there was no body, they had no grounds to arrest him. They let him go, but they had their first solid suspect. 2 days later, the body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, the last victim on the official list, was found downstream from the bridge. Now the police had a direct, albeit circumstantial, link. Wayne Williams was on the bridge at the approximate time and location that the final victim was likely dumped into the river. The investigation now focused intensely on him. But they still lacked the direct physical evidence to tie him to the murders. This is where the FBI's forensic laboratory and a pioneering forensic scientist named Harold Dedman would play a crucial role. The investigators began a painstaking search of Williams' home and car, collecting every possible piece of trace evidence. They vacuumed his carpets, took samples from his bedding, and even collected hair from his family's dog. What they found was a treasure trove of microscopic fibers. Williams lived in a home with a distinctive yellowish-green nylon carpet. His car was also carpeted with a different but equally distinctive material. The forensic lab began the monumental task of comparing these fibers from Williams' environment to the microscopic fibers that had been found on the bodies of the victims. At the time, fiber analysis was a relatively new and developing field of forensic science. This case would become its most high-profile and demanding test. The results were stunning. The yellowish-green nylon fibers from the carpet in Williams' bedroom were found on 12 of the murder victims. These fibers were relatively unusual. The manufacturer had produced a limited run of that specific color and material. The probability of another home in Atlanta having the same carpet was calculated to be extremely low. Furthermore, fibers from the carpet in Williams' station wagon were found on several other victims. But the evidence didn't stop there. The lab also found unusual violet-colored acetate fibers on several victims, which they were able to trace back to the bedspread in Williams' room. And perhaps most compellingly, they found dog hairs on some of the victims that were consistent with the hair of Williams' German Shepherd mix. The sheer number and variety of these fiber and hair links created what the prosecution would later call a fiber optic trail leading directly from the victims to Wayne Williams.
In 1982, Wayne Williams went on trial, but not for all 28 murders. The prosecution, in a strategic move, chose to try him only for the murders of the two adult victims, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. However, in order to establish a pattern of behavior, they were allowed to introduce evidence from 10 of the child murder cases. The fiber evidence was the heart of the prosecution's case. They used statistical analysis to argue that the probability of all these different, unusual fibers coincidentally appearing on so many victims was infinitesimally small.
Wayne Williams, who took the stand in his own defense, was arrogant and combative. He failed to present a credible alternative for how his fibers could have ended up on the victims. The jury was convinced by the overwhelming weight of the microscopic evidence. In February 1982, Williams was found guilty of the two murders and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. After his conviction, the police declared that he was responsible for at least 23 of the 29 murders on their list and closed the cases. Wayne Williams's fatal flaw was his ignorance of the microscopic world. He was a killer who operated in the visible world. He was careful about the big things: no witnesses, no fingerprints. He likely believed that by dumping the bodies, any evidence would be washed away. He had no concept that he was carrying a cloud of microscopic evidence with him wherever he went, a cloud generated by his own home environment, and that he was transferring this invisible signature to every person he came into contact with. The perfect anonymity of his crimes was pierced by the science of trace evidence. Locard's exchange principle, every contact leaves a trace, was demonstrated on a massive and complex scale. Williams was not caught by a single piece of evidence, but by a pattern, a consistent and repeated transfer of materials that could only be explained by his direct contact with the victims. The Atlanta child murders case remains controversial to this day. Williams has always maintained his innocence, and some believe that other killers, possibly the KKK, were responsible for some of the murders. The evidence was, in large part, circumstantial and probabilistic. However, the fiber evidence was undeniably powerful and groundbreaking for its time. It showcased the potential of microscopic analysis to solve cases that were otherwise unsolvable. This case pushed the boundaries of what was considered viable forensic evidence. It took the analysis of trace materials from a supporting role to the main stage. It demonstrated that even without a confession, a weapon, or a fingerprint, a case could be built on the silent, microscopic witnesses that cling to our clothes, our carpets, and our cars. Wayne Williams thought he was a ghost, but forensics proved that even ghosts leave a trail. From a killer betrayed by the fibers in his own home, we turn to one who was almost saved by a hoax, a case where the evidence itself was a lie designed to mislead. This is the story of the Yorkshire Ripper, a killer who terrorized the north of England for 5 years, and how the investigation was tragically derailed by a man who was not the killer, but whose taunting voice on a tape sent the police on a devastatingly wrong path.
Between 1975 and 1980, the county of West Yorkshire in northern England was haunted by a brutal serial killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper. The killer targeted women, mostly prostitutes, attacking them with hammers and then mutilating their bodies with knives. The attacks were savage and spread a wave of terror throughout the region. The police investigation, led by the West Yorkshire Constabulary, was one of the largest in British history, but it was plagued by mistakes and missed opportunities.
The killer, a lorry driver named Peter Sutcliffe, was, for a time, the beneficiary of these mistakes. He was interviewed by police no fewer than 9 times during the investigation, but was always discounted for various reasons. He was a man hiding in plain sight, able to continue his murderous spree because the police force was overwhelmed, their record-keeping was poor, and they were fixated on a series of clues that were, in fact, a deliberate and cruel deception. This deception began in 1978. The Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police, George Oldfield, who was leading the Ripper investigation, began to receive handwritten letters from a man claiming to be the killer. The letters taunted the police for their inability to catch him. Then, in June 1979, the police received an audio tape. On the tape, a man with a distinctive, gravelly voice and a strong Wearside accent from the Sunderland area directly addressed Oldfield, once again claiming responsibility for the murders and vowing to continue. The tape began with the chilling words, "I'm Jack." He went on to say, "I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer to catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." The tape was a direct challenge, a personal taunt from the killer to the man hunting him. The police, and George Oldfield in particular, were completely convinced that the tape was genuine. This belief would prove to be the single most catastrophic mistake of the entire investigation. The police held a major press conference, playing the tape for the public and appealing for help in identifying the man with the Wearside accent. They invested an enormous amount of resources, an estimated 1 million man-hours, into tracing the origin of the tape and the letters. They created a massive database of men with Wearside accents. The accent became the central and defining clue of the investigation. As a result, any suspect who did not have a Wearside accent was immediately downgraded or dismissed. This included Peter Sutcliffe. He was from Bradford in Yorkshire and had a local Yorkshire accent. During his 9 interviews, the fact that his voice did not match the voice on the tape was a key reason he was repeatedly eliminated from the inquiry. The police were so certain that the man on the tape was the Ripper that they were blinded to the truth that was right in front of them. The hoaxer, who became known as Wearside Jack, had effectively given the real killer a shield of invisibility. While the police were chasing a phantom voice from Sunderland, Peter Sutcliffe was free to kill again. He murdered at least 3 more women after the tape was received. Women whose lives might have been saved if the investigation had not been so tragically misdirected. The investigation became a national scandal. The police were criticized for their handling of the case, and women in the north of England lived in constant fear. The perfect crime, in this case, was not Sutcliffe's doing alone. It was aided and abetted by the hoaxer's intervention and the police's subsequent tunnel vision. Sutcliffe was a brutal and cunning killer, but his longevity was largely a result of this massive investigative blunder. The end for Peter Sutcliffe came not through the main Ripper investigation, but through a stroke of luck during a routine police check. On January 2, 1981, Sutcliffe was in a car with a prostitute in a known red light district in Sheffield. 2 police officers on patrol decided to check the car because it had false license plates. As they were questioning Sutcliffe, they got a call back that the plates were indeed false. They arrested him for theft of the plates. At the police station, they allowed him to go to the toilet before being put in a cell. While he was alone, Sutcliffe managed to hide a hammer and a knife he had concealed on his person. The next day, he was being questioned about the stolen plates when the arresting officer, remembering Sutcliffe's suspicious behavior, returned to the scene of the arrest. There, he found the hammer and knife that Sutcliffe had discarded. The officer immediately realized he had stumbled upon the Yorkshire Ripper. Once in custody and confronted with the evidence of the weapons, Peter Sutcliffe calmly confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper. He provided a detailed account of his 13 murders. His accent was Yorkshire, not Wearside. The voice on the tape was not his. The central clue that had dominated the investigation for over 2 years was a complete and utter fabrication. The evidence mistake in this case is a complex one. It was a mistake made by the police, a catastrophic failure to critically evaluate a piece of evidence. They fell victim to what is known as confirmation bias. They wanted the tape to be real because it provided a tangible, exciting clue in a case that had been full of dead ends. Once they latched onto this belief, they interpreted all other information through that lens. Sutcliffe didn't fit the clue, so he couldn't be the killer. They ignored other evidence that pointed directly to him, such as his car being spotted at several of the murder scenes.
The hoax itself was a cruel and selfish act that had deadly consequences. For decades, the identity of Wearside Jack remained a mystery. But in 2005, thanks to advances in DNA technology, police were able to re-examine the envelope from the original hoax letter. They found a small saliva sample under the seal. They ran the DNA and got a match. The hoaxer was a man named John Humble, an alcoholic loner from Sunderland who had a grudge against the police. He was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice.
The Yorkshire Ripper case is a sobering lesson in the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. It shows how a single, compelling, but ultimately false piece of evidence can derail a massive investigation, leading to tragic and avoidable consequences. The police were so focused on the voice of the man who wasn't the killer that they couldn't see the man who was, even when he was sitting right in front of them, time and time again.
Peter Sutcliffe's perfect run was not a product of his own genius, but of a flawed system that was led astray. The fatal flaw was not his, but the investigators'. They were betrayed by evidence that was designed to deceive, and their failure to see through the deception cost lives. It is a stark reminder that the goal of an investigation is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not to force the evidence to fit a preconceived theory. From a killer shielded by a hoax, we turn to one who was exposed by his own carelessness and the unique identifiers he left behind. This is the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a terrifying killer who seemed to be a motiveless, demonic force of nature, but whose capture was the result of a single fingerprint and a stolen shoe. In the summer of 1985, a palpable sense of fear descended upon the city of Los Angeles. A brutal, satanic serial killer was on the loose, breaking into homes in the dead of night. His attacks were random and incredibly violent. He raped, murdered, and robbed his victims, often leaving behind satanic symbols like pentagrams scrawled on the walls or on the bodies of his victims. He became known as the Night Stalker. The randomness of his crimes was what made him so terrifying. He had no clear victim profile. He attacked men, women, and children, from the very young to the very old. His targets were spread across numerous neighborhoods and socioeconomic groups. He used a variety of weapons: guns, knives, hammers, tire irons. This lack of a discernible pattern made him a nightmare for law enforcement to profile and predict. He seemed to be a force of pure, chaotic evil. For months, he terrorized Southern California. The public was in a panic. Gun sales soared. People barricaded their doors and windows at night. The police were under immense pressure, but they had very few leads. The killer was skilled at not leaving behind traditional evidence. He often wore gloves, and the chaotic nature of his crime scenes made it difficult to find useful clues. The perfect nature of his rampage was its apparent lack of motive or reason, which made him seem like an unstoppable phantom. But the Night Stalker, whose real name was Richard Ramirez, was not a demon. He was a man, a drifter and drug addict, and like any man, he was capable of making mistakes. His downfall would come from a combination of a single, crucial forensic break and his own careless habit of being a souvenir hunter. The first key mistake occurred during an attack in the city of Mission Viejo. Ramirez had stolen a Toyota station wagon and driven it to the home of his next victims. After the attack, he abandoned the car. A sharp-eyed neighborhood kid who had seen the suspicious car earlier reported it to the police. When the police processed the car, they found a single, clear fingerprint. Ramirez, who was usually so careful, had slipped up. He had touched the rearview mirror without his glove on. This fingerprint was a massive breakthrough. It was run through the new computerized automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, which was still in its early days. The system came back with a match. The print belonged to a 25-year-old man from Texas named Richard Ramirez, who had a minor criminal record for traffic violations and drug possession. For the first time, the Phantom had a name and a face. The police immediately released Ramirez's mugshot to the public. On August 30, 1985, his face was on the front page of every newspaper and on every television news broadcast in California. Ramirez was unaware that his identity had been discovered. He was on a bus returning to Los Angeles from a trip to Arizona. When he got off the bus and went into a convenience store, he saw his own face staring back at him from a newspaper rack. He panicked and fled. He tried to carjack a vehicle, but the driver fought back. He ran through the streets of an East Los Angeles neighborhood, not realizing he had run into a community that was on high alert. Residents recognized him from the news. A crowd began to form, chasing him through the streets. They cornered him, and a man named Jose Burgoyne struck him over the head with a steel rod, subduing him until the police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker was over, brought to an end by a mob of angry citizens who were no longer willing to live in fear. The fingerprint was the key that unlocked his identity, but another piece of evidence would become crucial in linking him to the wide array of his crimes. Ramirez was not just a killer, he was also a burglar. He stole money, jewelry, and other valuables from his victims' homes. But he also took personal items, souvenirs of his crimes. This habit, while psychologically satisfying for him, created a trail of physical evidence. One of the most important pieces of this evidence was a unique brand of shoe. At several of the Night Stalker crime scenes, investigators had found a distinctive shoe print. It was from an Avia brand athletic shoe, size 11.5. This was a relatively rare and specific type of shoe at the time. The shoe print became a linking signature for the crimes, but it wasn't until after his capture that its full significance became clear. When police searched for evidence to tie Ramirez to his many crimes, they had to build each case individually. One of his surviving victims was able to tell police that the attacker had stolen a unique piece of jewelry from her. Police were able to trace that stolen item to a pawn shop and then to a person who had bought it. This created a paper trail linking Ramirez to that specific crime. But it was the combination of all the evidence types that was so powerful. At his trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. There was the fingerprint from the car. There was the ballistics evidence linking the same gun to multiple crime scenes. There was the testimony of the surviving victims. And there was the shoe print evidence. The prosecution was able to show that the rare Avia shoe print was found at numerous crime scenes, and that Richard Ramirez wore that exact size and brand of shoe. While not as definitive as a fingerprint, it was another strong circumstantial link in the chain connecting him to the rampage. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During his sentencing, he infamously told the court, "You don't understand. You are not expected to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil." He was sentenced to death and died on death row in 2013 from complications of lymphoma. Richard Ramirez's fatal flaw was a classic case of criminal carelessness. For all his terrifying mystique, he was ultimately a sloppy criminal. The single fingerprint he left in the stolen car was a rookie mistake, a momentary lapse in his forensic awareness that cost him everything. It was the crack in his armor of anonymity, the thread that allowed investigators to unravel his entire secret identity. His habit of souvenir hunting, while common among serial offenders, also worked against him. While it didn't lead directly to his capture, it provided prosecutors with valuable evidence to link him to specific crimes after he was caught. It created a web of stolen property that was much easier to trace than the ephemeral evidence of his violent acts. He thought he was taking trophies to remember his power, but he was actually creating a physical record of his guilt. This case demonstrates the power of a single definitive piece of evidence. In an investigation with few leads and a seemingly random pattern of crimes, one clear fingerprint can change everything. It turns a search for a who into a search for a where. The Night Stalker case also highlights the importance of community vigilance. The APHIS system gave the police his name, but it was the citizens of East Los Angeles who ultimately took him off the streets. They refused to be victims, and their collective action brought a nightmare to an end. From a killer who left his mark with his shoes, we turn to a case where the crucial clue was buried with a victim for over 2 decades. This is the story of one of Britain's most notorious killer couples, the Moores murderers, and how a buried watch, a series of photographs, and a sister's unwavering dedication finally brought them to justice and revealed the horrifying extent of their crimes. In the 1960s, the area around Manchester, England, was haunted by the disappearances of several children and teenagers. The public was unaware that these were connected, that 2 of the most infamous killers in British history, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, were preying on the youth of the city. Brady and Hindley were a twisted couple, their relationship a toxic mix of sadism, manipulation, and a shared fascination with Nazi ideology. They saw murder as an existential act, a way to prove their superiority over society. Between 1963 and 1965, they committed crimes against at least 5 victims, ranging in age from 10 to 17. Their approach was methodical and premeditated. Hindley would often approach the victims and convince them to come with her, using her appearance as a seemingly trustworthy adult to lower their guard. She would then bring them to their location, where Brady would commit serious crimes against them before taking their lives. This shared criminal activity formed the basis of their disturbing partnership. Their perfect crime was built on the complete erasure of their victims. After the murders, they would drive the bodies out to the desolate and vast Saddleworth Moor, a bleak and windswept landscape east of Manchester. There, they would bury the bodies in shallow graves, leaving them to the elements. For years, the missing children cases remained unsolved. The Moor held its secrets well. Brady and Hindley believed they had committed the perfect, untraceable murders. They were so confident in their impunity that they even took photographs of their crimes. Brady, an avid photographer, documented their visits to the Moor, sometimes taking pictures of Hindley standing over the very spots where they had buried their victims. These photos were not just grim souvenirs. They were acts of supreme arrogance, a private celebration of their achievements. They believed these images would remain their secret forever. Their downfall came not from a police investigation, but from within their own twisted circle.
In October 1965, Hindley's 17-year-old brother-in-law, David Smith, witnessed Brady brutally murdering his final victim, Edward Ivins, with an axe in their home. Brady tried to implicate Smith in the crime, but Smith was horrified. He fled the house and immediately went to the police. He told them everything he had seen, leading them to the house where they found Ivins' body. Brady and Hindley were arrested for the murder of Edward Ivins. At first, the police had no idea that this was just the tip of the iceberg. They believed they were dealing with a single, gruesome murder. But as they searched the house, they began to uncover clues that pointed to a much darker and more extensive history of violence. They found the photographs Brady had taken, and they found an exercise book that contained a cryptic entry that seemed to be a plan for one of the murders. But the most crucial piece of evidence was found in a left luggage office at a Manchester train station. David Smith told the police that Brady had asked him to retrieve 2 suitcases from the station. The police got there first. Inside the suitcases, they found a chilling collection of items: whips, restraints, and, most importantly, a tape recording. On the tape was the horrifying sound of their 10-year-old victim, Leslie Ann Downey, pleading for her life as she was being abused and tortured. The tape was irrefutable proof of their involvement in at least one other murder. It was a piece of evidence so shocking and horrific that it would haunt everyone who heard it. The police now knew they were dealing with serial killers. The question was, where were the other bodies? The photographs taken on Saddleworth Moor were the only lead. They showed Hindley in various locations, but the vast, featureless landscape of the moor made it nearly impossible to pinpoint the exact spots. A massive search of the moor began. For weeks, hundreds of police officers and volunteers scoured the bleak landscape. They eventually found the body of Leslie Ann Downey, buried in a shallow grave. Then they found the remains of another victim, John Kilbride. But the other victims, Pauline Reed, Keith Bennett, and Edward Ivins, whose body was found in the house, were still missing on the moor. Brady and Hindley refused to cooperate, enjoying the power they still held over the police and the victims' families. In 1966, Brady and Hindley were convicted of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Ivins. Brady was also convicted of murdering John Kilbride. They were both sentenced to life in prison. For 2 decades, they refused to confess to any other murders, and the location of the remaining bodies remained a secret. The case of the Moors murders became a national obsession, a symbol of ultimate evil. Then, in the 1980s, Brady, in a series of letters with a journalist, finally began to hint at the other murders. This led to a new police investigation and a renewed search of the moor. In 1987, Brady and Hindley were taken back to Saddleworth Moor separately in an attempt to get them to reveal the burial sites. Hindley eventually led the police to the spot where they had buried 16-year-old Pauline Reed. It was during the excavation of Pauline Reed's grave that the final, crucial piece of evidence was discovered, a clue that had been buried with her for 24 years. As forensic archaeologists carefully unearthed her remains, they found a small, delicate object near her body, a gold wristwatch. The watch had stopped at 11:25. It was a poignant and tangible link to the moment of her death. But the watch was more than just a tragic artifact. It was also a critical piece of corroborating evidence. How could police be sure this was Pauline Reed's grave? The victim's sister, who had never given up hope of finding her, was able to provide the police with a photograph of Pauline taken shortly before she disappeared. In the photograph, she was wearing the exact same distinctive wristwatch. This provided a positive, personal identification that confirmed the remains were indeed hers. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's perfect crime was based on the idea that the Moor would keep their secrets forever. Their fatal flaw was their own arrogance and their need for psychological trophies. The tape recording and the photographs, which they kept as souvenirs of their power, became the very tools that exposed them. They had documented their own crimes, creating a roadmap that, while difficult to read, eventually led police to the truth. The discovery of the watch is a testament to the persistence of evidence. It survived underground for over 2 decades, a silent witness waiting to be found. It also highlights the crucial role that families play in cold case investigations. The sister's memory and her cherished photograph provided the final piece of the puzzle, a human connection that science alone could not have made. It was a victory of love and memory over the pure evil of the killers. Even after the renewed searches, the body of 12-year-old Keith Bennett has never been found. Ian Brady died in 2017 and Myra Hindley in 2002, taking the secret of his burial location to their graves. The Moores murders case is a chilling story of human depravity, but it is also a story of how even the most carefully concealed crimes can be unraveled by the arrogance of the perpetrators and the enduring power of a single, personal object. From a clue buried in the earth, we turn to one that traveled through the mail. This is a story that unfolded in the shadow of a national tragedy, a time of fear and uncertainty, where the weapon was not a gun or a knife, but a fine white powder. We will examine the 2001 Anthrax attacks and how the modern science of linguistic forensics helped to profile and identify the killer. In the weeks following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, a new wave of fear swept across the United States. Letters containing a mysterious white powder began to arrive at media outlets and the offices of 2 U.S. senators. The powder was anthrax, a deadly bacterium that can be fatal if inhaled. 5 people died from exposure to the anthrax and 17 others were infected. The country, already reeling from 9/11, was plunged into a state of high alert. This was an act of bioterrorism. The initial assumption was that the attacks were the work of al-Qaeda or another foreign terrorist group, a second wave of the 9/11 plot. The FBI launched a massive investigation, codenamed Amerithrax. The case was incredibly complex. The weapon was microscopic, and the delivery system was the vast and anonymous U.S. postal system. The killer, it seemed, could be anyone, anywhere. The perfect nature of this crime was its ability to induce mass panic with minimal resources. The killer had weaponized the mail, turning a mundane part of everyday life into a source of terror. The perpetrator was a ghost in the system, leaving behind only the deadly spores and a series of short, cryptic notes that accompanied them. These notes were the only direct communication from the killer, and they became a central focus of the investigation. The letters, addressed to news anchor Tom Brokaw and Senator Tom Daschle, contained chilling messages. They were written in a blocky, capitalized script and included phrases like 09101, "This is next," "Take penicillin now," "Death to America," "Death to Israel," "Allah is great." The handwriting and the message seemed to point directly to a jihadist extremist. But as forensic experts began to analyze the letters, they noticed subtle clues that suggested a different kind of author. The FBI brought in a team of linguistic experts to perform a forensic analysis of the language used in the notes. This discipline, known as forensic linguistics, involves the scientific analysis of language to profile an author or determine the meaning of a text. The linguists began to deconstruct the killer's words, looking for patterns, idiosyncrasies, and hidden meanings. They noticed several things that didn't fit the profile of a non-native English-speaking terrorist. The handwriting, while disguised, was fluid and natural. The grammar and syntax were perfect. But the most telling clues were in the word choices and the structure of the threats. The phrase, "Take penicillin now," was particularly strange. The misspelling of penicillin was one thing, but the instruction itself was odd. It was a suggestion of a cure, not a typical feature of a terrorist threat. It suggested the author had a scientific or medical background, someone who understood how anthrax worked and how it could be treated. The linguists also noted that the letters seemed to be deliberately crafted to mislead, to make the author appear to be a simple-minded foreign terrorist.
The phrases "death to America" and "Allah is great" felt tacked on, like a caricature of jihadist rhetoric rather than a genuine expression of it. The experts began to suspect that the killer was not a foreign terrorist at all, but a sophisticated, highly educated American who was trying to frame Al-Qaeda.
This linguistic profile, combined with the scientific analysis of the anthrax itself, began to point the investigation in a new direction. Genetic analysis of the anthrax spores revealed that they were of the AIM strain, a specific strain that was used in U.S. government laboratories. This was a bombshell. The killer was not an outsider. He was an insider, someone with access to one of the most secure biolabs in the country.
The investigation now focused on a small list of government scientists who had the access and expertise to carry out the attacks. The FBI's initial prime suspect was a scientist named Stephen Hatfield. He was publicly named as a person of interest, and his life was turned upside down by the intense media and law enforcement scrutiny. But after years of investigation, no evidence could be found to link him to the attacks. He was eventually exonerated and received a multi-million-dollar settlement from the government. The investigation had hit a dead end, but the FBI continued to work the case, using new scientific techniques to analyze the anthrax from the letters. They developed a groundbreaking method to extract and sequence the DNA of the specific batch of anthrax used in the attacks. This allowed them to create a unique genetic signature for the murder weapon. They then began the monumental task of testing all the anthrax samples stored in government labs across the country, looking for a match. Finally, they found it. The genetic signature of the anthrax in the letters was a perfect match to a single flask of anthrax stored at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USMRID, at Fort Detrick, Maryland. This flask was under the sole control of one man, Dr. Bruce Edwards Ivins, a senior biodefense researcher. Ivins had been on the list of potential suspects for years, but he had not been the primary focus. Now, the investigation zeroed in on him. They re-examined his behavior and statements from 2001. They found he had sent a series of strange, rambling emails and had a history of mental health issues. They also discovered that he had been working late, off-the-books hours in the lab in the weeks leading up to the attacks, the only person with access to the specific anthrax batch. The linguistic evidence from the original notes also began to fit with Ivins's profile. He was a brilliant scientist, but also a deeply troubled man with a history of obsessive behavior. The misleading nature of the letters, the attempt to frame another group, was consistent with a psychological profile of someone who felt like an outsider and wanted to create a crisis to prove his own importance. Some theories suggest Ivins, who was working on an anthrax vaccine, may have orchestrated the attacks to drum up support and funding for his research. In 2008, as the FBI was closing in and preparing to charge him with the crimes, Bruce Ivins committed suicide. He never confessed, and because he was never tried, some doubts about his guilt remain. However, the Department of Justice and the FBI formally closed the Amerithrax case in 2010, concluding that Dr. Bruce Ivins was the sole perpetrator of the 2001 anthrax attacks. The fatal flaw in this perfect bioterrorist plot was the perpetrator's own words. The killer believed he was creating a clever deception, a false flag, that would send the investigation on a wild goose chase. And for a time, it worked. But he underestimated the power of language to reveal the truth about its author. He was so focused on the message he wanted to send that he failed to see the unintentional message he was also sending, the clues embedded in his grammar, his spelling, and his phrasing. This case was a landmark for the field of forensic linguistics. It demonstrated that a person's language is as unique as their fingerprint, a concept known as an idiolect. The way we construct sentences, the words we choose, the mistakes we make, all of these can create a profile that can point to a specific type of person or even an individual. The anthrax killer thought he could create a perfect misdirection. But his own intelligence and education betrayed him. He couldn't successfully imitate the language of a less educated, non-native speaker. His own linguistic habits, the very patterns of his thought, were embedded in the ink on the page, providing the first crucial clue that the enemy was not without, but within. From the invisible threat of anthrax, we turn to the digital trail left behind in a case that shocked the world. This is the story of the death of a global superstar, and how the computer records of his personal physician revealed a pattern of negligence and deception that amounted to a criminal act. We will examine the case of Dr. Conrad Murray and the death of Michael Jackson. On June 25, 2009, the world was stunned by the news that Michael Jackson, the king of pop, had died at the age of 50. He was on the verge of a massive comeback tour and appeared to be in good health. His sudden death was a mystery and immediately sparked a massive investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department and the LA County coroner. The official cause of death was determined to be acute propofol intoxication combined with the effects of several other sedatives. Propofol is a powerful general anesthetic, a drug used to put patients to sleep for major surgery in a hospital setting. It is not a drug that should ever be administered at home, and certainly not as a sleep aid. The investigation quickly focused on the man who had administered the drug, Michael Jackson's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. Dr. Murray had been hired by Jackson to be his personal doctor during the upcoming This Is It concert tour. He was being paid $150,000 a month. His primary job, it seemed, was to help Jackson combat his chronic and severe insomnia. Dr. Murray told investigators that he had been giving Jackson propofol every night for 2 months to help him sleep, a medical practice that is unheard of and universally condemned by the medical community. On the night of Jackson's death, Murray claimed that he was trying to wean Jackson off the drug. He said he had given him a series of other sedatives, but Jackson remained awake. Finally, according to Murray, he relented and gave Jackson a small 25-milligram dose of propofol. He claimed he then left the room for just a few minutes to make some phone calls, and when he returned, Jackson was not breathing. This was the story he told the police, a narrative of a tragic accident, a medical event that was unforeseen and unavoidable. This was Dr. Murray's attempt to craft the perfect explanation. He portrayed himself as a caring doctor trying to help a difficult patient, a man who had made a reasonable medical judgment that had gone tragically wrong. He tried to frame the event as a non-criminal, albeit unfortunate outcome. But his story was full of holes, and investigators began to unravel it by looking at the digital evidence he had left behind. The most damning evidence came from his own cell phone records and the forensic analysis of his computer. Dr. Murray had claimed he was away from Jackson's bedside for only a few minutes, but his cell phone records told a very different story. They showed that in the hours leading up to Jackson's death, and crucially, in the period after he had administered the fatal dose of propofol, Murray was engaged in a flurry of phone calls, text messages, and emails. He was speaking with his girlfriend, his medical practice in Houston, and a business associate. He was not, as he claimed, diligently monitoring his patient. This digital trail proved that he had been distracted and inattentive for a significant period of time. A patient under the influence of propofol requires constant, one-on-one monitoring of their heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. Dr. Murray had not only administered the drug in an inappropriate setting, but he had then abandoned his patient at the most critical moment. His cell phone became the key witness against him, providing a precise timeline of his negligence. Furthermore, the investigation uncovered a pattern of deception. Dr. Murray had initially tried to conceal the fact that he had been giving Jackson propofol at all. When paramedics arrived, he failed to tell them about the drug, information that could have been crucial for their attempts to revive him. He also ordered one of Jackson's security guards to help him clean up the scene, telling him to remove IV bags and other medical supplies before calling 911. The call to 911 was not made until more than an hour after Murray had found Jackson not breathing. Forensic analysis of his computer also revealed crucial evidence. Investigators found that Dr. Murray had been ordering massive quantities of propofol and other sedatives, having them shipped to his girlfriend's address to avoid suspicion. He had created a paper and digital trail of his reckless and unethical medical practice. The emails and invoices found on his computer demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was not just a one-time mistake, but a sustained and dangerous course of treatment. In 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray went on trial for involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution's case was built on the timeline provided by his cell phone records and the testimony of medical experts who described his treatment of Michael Jackson as an egregious deviation from the standard of care. They argued that he had acted not as a doctor, but as an employee, and his desire to keep his lucrative job had led him to abandon all medical ethics. Dr. Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served 2 years before being released. The judge, in his sentencing, called Murray's actions a disgrace to the medical profession. Dr. Murray's fatal flaw was his belief that he could control the narrative of Michael Jackson's death. He tried to create a story of a tragic accident, but he failed to account for the indelible digital record of his own actions. In the modern world, our phones and computers are silent witnesses to our lives. They record our communications, our locations, and our interests. For Dr. Murray, his iPhone was his undoing. It provided a minute-by-minute account of his inattention, a digital alibi that proved he was not where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to be doing. This case is a powerful example of how digital forensics has become a cornerstone of modern criminal investigation, even in cases that don't seem to be digital crimes. The crime was a medical one, but the evidence that proved it was found in the data streams of a cell phone. Dr. Murray thought he was just making calls and sending emails, but he was actually creating the evidence that would convict him. He was so focused on the physical scene, on removing the IV bags and hiding the vials of drugs, that he completely forgot about the invisible evidence he was generating with every tap on his phone screen. His attempt to create a perfect story was shattered by the simple, objective, and time-stamped truth of his own data. From the digital world, we now descend into the cold and brutal world of a contract killer, a man who claimed to have murdered over 100 people for the mob. This is the story of Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, and how a seemingly minor forensic oversight in one of his planned perfect murders provided the key clue that led to his downfall. Richard Kuklinski was a man who lived a chilling double life. To his family and neighbors in the New Jersey suburbs, he was a successful businessman, a loving husband and father. But in the criminal underworld, he was known as the Iceman, a ruthless and prolific contract killer for the mafia. He earned his nickname for his method of freezing his victims' bodies to obscure their time of death, a technique designed to thwart forensic investigation. Kuklinski was a student of murder. He experimented with various methods, from guns and knives to bombs and his personal favorite, cyanide poison. He prided himself on his professionalism and his ability to commit the perfect, untraceable murder. He claimed to have killed his first man at the age of 14 and to have continued his grim trade for over 30 years, operating completely under the radar of law enforcement. For decades, he was a ghost, a name whispered in fear, but a man the law could not touch. The perfect nature of his crimes was his versatility and his forensic awareness. He varied his methods to avoid creating a recognizable pattern. He would remove his victims' teeth and fingers to prevent identification. And his signature freezing technique was a clever, if gruesome, way to confuse medical examiners. He was a meticulous planner who left little to chance. However, by the 1980s, law enforcement agencies were beginning to close in on the organized crime families he worked for.
A joint task force, led by the New Jersey State Police, was formed to investigate a series of unsolved murders that they believed were linked to a single, highly professional hitman. Their primary challenge was the lack of any direct evidence. Kuklinski was a phantom. They needed a way to get inside his secret world. The task force decided to launch a long and complex undercover operation. They enlisted a special agent, Dominic Polifrone, to pose as a well-connected criminal named Dominic Provenzano. Polifrone's mission was to infiltrate Kuklinski's circle, gain his trust, and get him to incriminate himself. For 18 months, Polifrone lived his cover, meeting with Kuklinski, talking about the business of crime, and slowly building a relationship. During their conversations, which were secretly recorded, Kuklinski began to boast about his past exploits. He talked about his methods, his contempt for his victims, and his skill as a killer. He even offered to form a partnership with the undercover agent, a new team of killers for hire. The police now had him on tape talking about murder, but they needed more. They needed to catch him in the act of planning or attempting a crime. So they devised a sting. Agent Polifrone told Kuklinski that he had a job for him. He wanted to hire Kuklinski to murder a wealthy associate in a staged robbery and then procure a large quantity of cyanide for another hit. Kuklinski eagerly agreed. He began to plan the murder with Polifrone, detailing exactly how he would do it. This was the moment the police had been waiting for. Kuklinski's plan for the cyanide hit was a classic example of his perfect crime methodology. He instructed Polifrone on how to administer the poison. He suggested lacing the victim's food with the cyanide, but he gave one very specific and ultimately fatal piece of advice. He told Polifrone that after the victim was dead, he should turn the body over and let it lie face down for a while. He claimed this was to let the lividity drain from the face, making the death look more natural, like a heart attack. This piece of advice, this small detail from the master of murder, was a stunning forensic blunder. It was a piece of pure, unscientific nonsense. Lividity, or livor mortis, is the purplish discoloration of the skin that occurs after death, caused by the settling of blood due to gravity. It cannot be drained. In fact, turning the body over would create a contradictory pattern of lividity, a clear sign to any competent medical examiner that the body had been moved after death. It was a telltale sign of foul play, not a way to conceal it. This mistake was a revelation to the investigators. It showed that for all his boasting and his fearsome reputation, Kuklinski was not the forensic genius he claimed to be. He was an experienced killer, but his science was based on myth and misconception. This small, incorrect detail gave the investigators a powerful piece of evidence. It was a unique and incorrect fact that was part of Kuklinski's personal knowledge base, his signature of ignorance. They also had him on tape agreeing to the murder-for-hire plot and providing the undercover agent with a sample of cyanide. The net was closing. On December 17, 1986, the police moved in to arrest him. They set up a roadblock and surrounded his car, knowing that he was always armed and dangerous. Kuklinski, the man who claimed to have killed over 100 people without emotion, was finally captured. Kuklinski was charged with 5 murders, based on the evidence from the undercover operation and connections they were now able to make to several cold cases. The forensic blunder about lividity became a key part of the prosecution's case. They were able to link him to the death of a pharmacist whose body had been found with contradictory lividity, exactly the kind of mistake Kuklinski had advised the undercover agent to make. It was a forensic signature that pointed directly to his flawed methodology. In 1988, Richard Kuklinski was convicted of the 5 murders and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. He would spend the rest of his life in prison giving a series of chilling interviews in which he confessed to numerous other murders. He died in prison in 2006. The Iceman's fatal flaw was his own ignorance, masked by an aura of expertise. He had built a terrifying legend around himself, a myth of the perfect, unstoppable killer. But the myth was just that.
His methods, which he believed were so clever, were often based on flawed gangland science. The freezing of the bodies, his signature move, was also not as effective as he believed. Modern forensic techniques can often find subtle signs that reveal the body has been frozen and thawed. This case demonstrates that a criminal's belief in their own perfection is often their greatest weakness. Kuklinski was so confident in his knowledge that he freely shared his trade secrets with the undercover agent. He was teaching his student how to commit the perfect murder, but in doing so, he was actually teaching the police how to catch him. He was revealing the unique flaws in his own thinking. It is a powerful example of how undercover operations can succeed by exploiting a criminal's ego. Agent Polifrone didn't just fool Kuklinski, he became his confidant, his student, his partner. He created a space where Kuklinski felt safe to let down his guard and reveal his true self. And in that space, the legend of the Iceman melted away, revealing a brutal but ultimately fallible man. From a killer's flawed science, we travel back to one of the most famous and debated criminal cases of the 20th century. This is a story of a crime that shocked the nation, the crime of the century, and how a single misplaced strand of hair on a wooden ladder became a central and controversial piece of evidence. We will re-examine the Lindbergh kidnapping and the trial of Bruno Hauptmann. On the evening of March 1, 1932, a crime occurred that would grip the United States in a state of unprecedented horror and fascination. Charles Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of the world-famous aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was abducted from his nursery on the second floor of their home in Hopewell, New Jersey. The kidnapper had used a crude, homemade wooden ladder to reach the window, leaving behind a ransom note demanding $50,000. The case became an instant media sensation. Charles Lindbergh was an American hero, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. The kidnapping of his child was seen as an attack on the nation itself. A massive investigation was launched, but the initial search for the baby was fruitless. The perfect nature of the crime was its sheer audacity and the seeming lack of any immediate clues. The kidnapper had vanished into the night, leaving only the ladder, the note, and a few muddy footprints. For weeks, the Lindberghs negotiated with the kidnappers through a series of intermediaries and newspaper columns. Eventually, the ransom was paid in a clandestine meeting in a Bronx cemetery. But the baby was not returned. The nation held its breath, hoping for a miracle. The miracle never came. On May 12, 1932, the body of the Lindbergh baby was discovered in a shallow grave in the woods a few miles from the Lindbergh home. He had been killed by a massive blow to the head, likely on the night of the kidnapping. The case was now a murder investigation, and the hunt for the killer intensified. The investigation stretched on for over 2 years, with few solid leads. The police had the ransom money, which had been paid in gold certificates that were soon to be taken out of circulation, making them easy to trace. They patiently waited for someone to start spending the marked bills. Then, in September 1934, a gas station attendant in New York City received a $10 gold certificate from a customer. He thought it was suspicious and wrote down the car's license plate number. The bill was traced back to the Lindbergh ransom money. The license plate was registered to a German immigrant and carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Police descended on Hauptmann's home in the Bronx. In his garage, they found over $14,000 of the Lindbergh ransom money hidden away. Hauptmann was arrested, and the police were certain they had their man. Hauptmann claimed that the money had been left with him by a friend, Isidor Fish, who had since returned to Germany and died. He denied any involvement in the kidnapping. Now the prosecution had to build a case that went beyond the money. They needed to physically link Hauptmann to the crime scene. Their case would be built on a collection of circumstantial evidence, including handwriting analysis of the ransom notes and the testimony of witnesses. But the most crucial and innovative piece of physical evidence was the ladder itself. The homemade 3-section ladder that was left at the crime scene was a unique object. The police brought in a wood expert named Arthur Kohler from the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory. Kohler began a painstaking, scientific deconstruction of the ladder. He identified the types of wood used and noticed that the tool marks on the wood were distinctive. He also found a specific rail on the ladder, known as rail 16, that was made from a different type of wood and had 4 nail holes in it. When the police searched Hauptmann's home, they found that a section of the flooring in his attic was missing. Arthur Kohler was able to match the wood from rail 16 of the ladder directly to the wood in Hauptmann's attic floor. The grain pattern, the species of wood, North Carolina pine, and even the 4 nail holes lined up perfectly with the joists in the attic. It was a stunning piece of forensic carpentry, a direct link from the ladder at the crime scene to the home of the suspect. But the prosecution wanted more. They wanted to place Hauptmann himself at the scene. This is where the single strand of hair comes into play. During the examination of the ladder, a microscopic piece of evidence was found embedded in the wood, a single human hair. This hair was then compared to hair samples taken from Bruno Hauptmann. Under the microscope, an expert testified that the hair from the ladder was indistinguishable from Hauptmann's hair. In the 1930s, hair analysis was a very new and rudimentary science. It was based purely on visual comparison of characteristics like color, thickness, and texture. It was not the definitive science of DNA analysis that we have today. However, in the courtroom, it was presented as strong scientific evidence. The combination of the ransom money, the handwriting, the wood from the ladder, and now the hair created a powerful web of evidence around Hauptmann. In 1935, Bruno Hauptmann was convicted of the murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. and sentenced to death. He was executed in the electric chair in 1936, maintaining his innocence to the very end. The Lindbergh case was a landmark in the use of scientific evidence in court. Arthur Kohler's work on the ladder was a masterclass in forensic deduction and is still studied today. However, the case also serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations and potential misrepresentation of forensic science. The hair analysis in particular has been heavily criticized in the years since the trial. Modern experts agree that a visual comparison of hair can never be a definitive match. At best, it can show that a suspect cannot be excluded. To present it as a positive identification was a gross overstatement of its scientific weight. Bruno Hauptmann's conviction was the result of a series of mistakes and pieces of evidence, but the most debated is the hair. Was it his fatal flaw, a tiny piece of himself that he unknowingly left behind? Or was it a piece of junk science that was used to bolster a circumstantial case and ensure a conviction in a case where the public was demanding a culprit? The truth is likely somewhere in between. The evidence against Hauptmann, particularly the money and the wood, was very strong, but the hair evidence was an example of the science of the time being pushed beyond its limits. This case demonstrates how the definition of a fatal flaw can change as science evolves. In 1935, leaving a hair behind was seen as leaving a definitive link. Today, without DNA, it would be considered weak associative evidence. Hauptmann's crime was perfect only in its initial execution, but he made a series of classic criminal blunders. He used traceable money, and he built the central tool of his crime from materials in his own home. He created a trail, and the investigators of the day, using the tools they had, were able to follow it. The controversy over the evidence in the Hauptmann case reminds us that science is not static. What is considered a foolproof method in one era can be seen as flawed and unreliable in the next. The pursuit of justice requires not just the use of science, but a constant, critical evaluation of its methods and its limitations. From the crime of the century, we move to a crime that defined a new era of domestic terrorism. This is the story of a man who declared war on his own country and how his perfect plan to disappear after his attack was foiled by a missing license plate and the sharp memory of a state trooper. We will examine the Oklahoma City bombing and the capture of Timothy McVeigh.
On April 19, 1995, at 9:02 a.m., a massive truck bomb exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. The explosion tore the face off the 9-story building, killing 168 people, including 19 children in a daycare center, and injuring hundreds more. It was, at the time, the deadliest act of terrorism on U.S. soil. The attack was a profound shock to the nation, a horrifying intrusion of mass casualty violence into the American heartland. The crime was designed to be both devastatingly destructive and perfectly anonymous. The bomb was made from common agricultural fertilizer and racing fuel, materials that were difficult to trace. It was housed in a rented Ryder truck, a vehicle chosen for its ubiquity and anonymity. The perpetrator's plan was to park the truck, light the fuse, and simply walk away, disappearing back into the fabric of the country, leaving behind only chaos and a message of anti-government hatred. The man behind the attack was Timothy McVeigh, a 27-year-old U.S. Army veteran who had become consumed by a paranoid right-wing ideology. He was motivated by a desire for revenge against the federal government for its handling of the Waco siege exactly 2 years earlier. He had meticulously planned the attack for months with the help of his co-conspirator, Terry Nichols. He believed he had crafted the perfect act of anonymous rebellion. After parking the truck and lighting the fuses, McVeigh walked calmly to his getaway car, a 1977 Mercury Marquis, which he had parked several blocks away. He then drove north out of Oklahoma City, heading for the highway. He had successfully carried out the attack and was now in the process of his clean escape. He believed he was home free, a ghost who had delivered a fatal blow to the system and vanished. But just 75 minutes after the bombing, and about 80 miles north of Oklahoma City, McVeigh's perfect getaway hit a snag. He was pulled over by Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger. The reason for the stop was not because he was a suspected terrorist. At this point, no one knew who was responsible for the bombing. The reason was far more mundane. McVeigh's Mercury Marcus did not have a license plate. Trooper Hanger approached the vehicle. McVeigh was calm and cooperative, but the trooper noticed a bulge under McVeigh's jacket. He asked McVeigh if he was carrying a weapon. McVeigh admitted that he was. He was carrying a Glock pistol loaded with black Talon hollow point bullets, which were designed to expand on impact. Trooper Hanger immediately arrested McVeigh for carrying a concealed weapon and for driving without a license plate. McVeigh was taken to the county jail in Perry, Oklahoma. He was booked under his own name. For the next 2 days, he sat in a jail cell, an anonymous figure arrested on minor charges. He was just hours away from being released on bail. He was so close to slipping through their fingers and disappearing for good. Meanwhile, the largest criminal investigation in U.S. history was unfolding in Oklahoma City. FBI investigators were painstakingly piecing together the evidence from the blast site. They found the rear axle of the Ryder truck, which had been thrown several blocks by the explosion. On the axle was a vehicle identification number, VIN. This was a critical breakthrough. They traced the VIN to a truck rental agency in Junction City, Kansas. An FBI artist worked with the employees of the agency to create a composite sketch of the man who had rented the truck under the name Robert Kling. This sketch was released to the public and broadcast nationwide. A motel owner in Junction City recognized the man in the sketch as a guest who had stayed at her motel under his real name, Timothy McVeigh. The FBI now had a name. They ran a check on Timothy McVeigh and discovered that he was currently in custody in the Noble County Jail in Perry, Oklahoma, on a weapons charge and was about to be released. In a frantic race against time, the FBI contacted the jail and told them to hold McVeigh. The anonymous man in the orange jumpsuit, arrested for a missing license plate, was now the prime suspect in the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in American history. His perfect getaway had been foiled by a simple piece of metal that should have been on the back of his car.
Timothy McVeigh's fatal flaw was a combination of arrogance and a simple, careless oversight. He had spent months meticulously planning every detail of the bombing, from the composition of the explosive to the timing of the fuse. But he had neglected the most basic element of a successful getaway, an inconspicuous vehicle. Driving a car without a license plate is one of the surest ways to attract the attention of law enforcement. It was a stunningly amateurish mistake for someone who had just carried out such a complex and destructive act. It suggests a level of overconfidence, a belief that after the main event, the small details no longer mattered. He was so focused on the bomb that he failed to properly plan the escape. He had become the anonymous agent of destruction he wanted to be, but he couldn't maintain that anonymity for more than an hour.
This case is a powerful illustration of how routine police work can intersect with major criminal investigations in unexpected ways. Trooper Hanger was not looking for a terrorist. He was enforcing traffic laws. But his diligence, his attention to detail, and his decision to make that stop were the critical events that prevented Timothy McVeigh from becoming a ghost. It was a textbook example of the broken windows theory of policing, that paying attention to small violations can prevent or solve major crimes.
McVeigh was tried and convicted of the bombing. In 2001, he was executed by lethal injection. His case stands as a chilling reminder of the threat of domestic extremism, but also as a testament to the power of a single, observant police officer and the fatal consequences of a criminal's most minor mistake. The perfect crime, even one on such a massive and horrific scale, can be undone by the simplest of flaws.
We have journeyed through a landscape of human fallibility, from the dawn of forensic science to the cutting edge of the digital age. We have seen meticulous plans, brilliant deceptions, and brutal acts of violence, all undone by a single, often unforeseen mistake. A fingerprint in wet paint, a grain of pollen on a car mat, a deleted file on a floppy disk, a boastful comment to a coworker, a parking ticket on a windshield. These are the fatal flaws, the tiny grains of sand that can bring the most formidable criminal machine to a grinding halt.
The concept of the perfect crime remains a powerful and enduring myth. It speaks to a desire for control, for intellectual mastery, for the ability to impose one's will on the world without consequence. But as these 22 cases have shown, this is a fantasy. Reality is far too complex, far too interconnected for any single mind to control all its variables. The world is a web of evidence, and every action we take causes a vibration in that web. We have seen how the nature of that evidence has evolved. A century ago, a criminal's primary concern was leaving a visible trace, a footprint, a weapon, a witness. Today, the concerns are infinitely more complex. The modern criminal must contend with a world that is constantly recording them. Their movements are tracked by GPS. Their communications are stored on servers. Their financial transactions are logged, and their very DNA is a permanent record of their identity that can now be traced through their distant relatives. The arms race between the criminal and the investigator is a perpetual one. As technology creates new ways to commit crimes, it also creates new ways to solve them. The criminal who believes they have found a loophole, a blind spot in the system, is often simply operating on borrowed time. They are making a bet that science and law enforcement will not catch up, a bet that history has shown is almost always a losing one. But beyond the technology, beyond the science, we have also seen a deeper, more fundamental reason why the perfect crime is a myth: human nature. The same psychological drivers that lead a person to commit a heinous crime, arrogance, ego, greed, rage, are often the very same drivers that lead them to make a mistake. The need to boast, the desire to taunt, the panic that sets in under pressure, the simple carelessness born of overconfidence. These are the timeless, unchangeable flaws in the human operating system that no amount of planning can eliminate. Dennis Rader's ego drove him to send the floppy disk. Mark Winger's greed drove him to file the lawsuit. Ted Bundy's rage drove him to leave the bite mark. In each case, the fatal flaw was not an external variable, but an internal one. They were not outsmarted by the police so much as they were defeated by their own character. The unsolvable case is becoming a dying breed. The relentless march of technology, particularly in the field of DNA and data analysis, means that evidence can now wait patiently for decades, holding its secrets until science is ready to unlock them. The cold case is no longer a closed book, but a story waiting for its final chapter to be written by a new generation of forensic tools. For the criminal who thinks they have gotten away with it, the past is no longer a safe harbor. It is a ticking time bomb.
So, the next time we hear a story of a seemingly perfect, baffling crime, let us remember these cases. Let us remember that somewhere in the narrative, hidden in plain sight, or buried deep in the microscopic or digital world, there is a flaw. There is a mistake. There is a piece of evidence that is waiting to speak. For in the end, the truth has a persistence that no criminal plan, no matter how perfect, can ever hope to match. The evidence is always there. It is simply a matter of finding it. And as science and human ingenuity continue to advance, there are fewer and fewer places for the truth to hide.